we could play that video.
Dreams, I walk free in the city streets. 2,500 days plus 50 weeks, doing hard time for these WikiLeaks, trying to bring the truth out. Man, it only gets you heat, and then they gag you. You don't get to speak, and when you get the leak, they try to hit delete. The masses of the masses, they want the shit discreet. That's why my middle finger's up to these sick elites. Free speech, it's the freedom of press. Take your deepest, darkest secrets, never leave them unsaid. If I'm a thief, then I'm a thief for the people you dread. The people of the red, white and blue, you keep them in bed. Seeing the sheep, keep them asleep, deceiving the weak. Keep seeking the leaks till you cease, and I see your defeat. Until I'm deceased underneath a freezing red sheet. Become a dead man, then I hit the switch and release. When Goldman Sachs is your creditor, you kill the messenger. Stories axed by the editor, you kill the messenger. Pay to play on the regular, kill the messenger. Need to silence any questioners, you kill the messenger. And outside my window a figure quickly creeps. They dark as night like some motherfucking chimney sweeps. Whiskey what my Mickey keeps, dying in my kidneys weak. Silence of my risky tweets is what the grand jury seeks. I'm wanting peace like 7 years in Tibet. Now rest in peace like 7 years under threat. Cause I've released 7 vaults, they upset. They under the rape sentence, but the US still insists to rest. I guess it's a sin to take the truth and disseminate. MLK to Gandhi, take aim and eliminate. And I don't say I'm great, just wanna say what's fake. But if they kill me, a million others will take my place. The CIA's post like a knife the sharpest. All hypocrisy, lies, and heartless. They want to stop me, my life make my heart quit. Cause democracy dies in the darkness. When Goldman Sachs is your creditor, you kill the messenger. Stories axed by the editor, you kill the messenger. Pay to play on the regular, you kill the messenger. Need to silence any questioners, you kill the messenger. When the vote count is irregular, you kill the messenger. You caught spying on a senator, you kill the messenger. Removing voters from the register, you kill the messenger. Need to silence any questioners, you kill the messenger. In my dreams, I walk free in the city streets. 2,500 days plus 50 weeks, doing hard time for these WikiLeaks, trying to bring the truth out. Man, it only gets you heat, and then they gag you. You don't get to speak, and when you get the leak, they try to hit the leak. The masters of the masses, they want this shit to street. That's why my middle finger's up to these sick elites. Playing on the regular. You keep the messenger. Free speech is the freedom of press. Take your deepest, darkest secrets, never leave them unsaid. If I'm a thief, then I'm a thief for the people you dread. The people want the red, while the blue you keep them in bed. Seeking the sheep, keep them asleep, deceiving the weak. Keep seeking the leech till you cease, and I see your defeat. Until I'm deceased underneath a freezer red sheet. Become a dead man, then I hit the switch and release. Outside my window, a figure quickly creeps. They dark as night like some motherfucking chimney sweeps. Whiskey what my Mickey keeps, dying in my kidneys weak. Silence of my risky tweets, what the grand jury seeks. I'm wanting peace, like 7 years in Tibet. Now rest in peace, like 7 years under threat. Cause I've released 7 vaults, they upset. They ended the rape sentence, but the US still insists to rest. I guess it's a sin to take the truth and disseminate. And okay to Gandhi, take him and eliminate. And I don't say I'm great, just wanna say what's fake. But if they kill me, 1,000,000 others will take my place. The CIA's post like a knife the sharpest. All hypocrisy, lies, and heartless. They want to stop me, my life, make my heart quit. Cause democracy dies in the darkness. Cause democracy dies in the darkness. You kill the messenger. You kill the messenger. Democracy dies in the darkness. Darkness.
Feeling cold now, I got the heater on. Feeling sold out, even though I'm keeping strong. But can I hold out when every bit of freedom's gone? They want me rolled out, never to sing freedom song. I wanna see the sky, I wanna feel the rain. But gotta keep away from windows, that's some window pane. It's just a shame, couldn't have planned out all our dreams. Now I scream, cause there's a man in the machine. But the train is off the tracks, and damn, it's losing steam. I wanna call Christine, I haven't seen since 013. I'm missing life like 3 strikes each night. Seems like 3 nights ain't right. Can't fight, space light, hate life. Wanting to be snake-like, shedding off this gray life. In the dark, can't make light. But where I'm headed now is brake lights. Where I'm headed now, they break lights. Counting days like brake lights, feeling weight like brake lights. Had a great life, brake lights, brake lights, brake lights. Out of place like brake lights, in my face like brake lights. Counting days like brake lights, brake lights, brake lights. Sit here asking, what have I done? If these strings were cut, I'd see my son. And if I could just fly from this place, then I'd hold you in my love embrace. And if I could just speak to you now, I'd renew my vow and be in the now. Is this me in denial? Wanna remove stress from your brow and pay you back some way, somehow. But it's painted black, can see the way back now. But how's the house and how's your mom? I doubt the way the media portrays me makes you hate me. But to think you see that daily makes me crazy, that just ain't me.
This is without a doubt going to be this generation's Free Mandela movement. Every single generation must fight again the same battles that previous generations have fought.
Brake lights, count days like brake lights, 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 brake lights.
Welcome to the 10th online vigil for Julian Assange. We've now moved to a weekly format. This is the third week we've been doing this. 2 weeks ago, we had a great show with Senator Mike Gravel and Dan Ellsberg, going back over the days when Ellsberg gave Mike Gravel the Pentagon Papers, which Senator Gravel read into the record. Last week, we had special guest Jose Rivera, an Ecuadorian journalist, who brought us great detail and very frank assessment of Julian Assange's legal case in Ecuador. He had lost an appeal, and it was a very bleak scenario that Rivera laid out for us, in which he basically said that there was no such thing as an independent court or justice system in Ecuador, and that the prospects of winning a higher appeal were not great. But it was very informative to learn all about that. This week, we have a bunch of guests lined up for us as well. Each show is quite different. We never know how it's going to turn out when we begin, but somehow we're always pleased. So I hope that happens this week as well. I just want to make one point here for people who are maybe joining this for the first time and don't know a lot about Julian Assange. We kind of assume that our viewers understand this case. And I just wanted to point out why the United States government and the British government want this man so much, and why the Ecuadorian government seems to be negotiating with them to hand him over. Julian Assange, when he began WikiLeaks shortly after, began releasing highly damaging secret information about particularly the U.S. government, but other governments as well, including Russia and Israel. And in particular, he revealed war crimes, which appear to be war crimes anyway on the video. The evidence would seem to stand up in court, of American pilots shooting down in cold blood innocent civilians in Iraq and then laughing about it. And the whole Afghan cables also revealed corruption and criminality. So obviously the interests of these individual men, mostly men and women in powerful positions in the US and the UK, their own interests are at stake, their own personal careers and ambitions, their lust for power and more, have a man standing in their way, threatening to unveil even more about what they're up to, and that's Julian Assange. So Assange has been in the Ecuadorian embassy for 6 years now. I'd love to know exactly how many weeks it is so I can announce that each week, and I'm going to find that out, because Assange cannot leave the embassy. He will be arrested by the British authorities for a minor charge of skipping bail. But once that would be done, the United States has an extradition order waiting, and we're going to hear from Professor Francis Boyle, University of Illinois, in just a moment to talk about the U.S.-British extradition treaty, which is very relevant to the situation of Julian Assange right now. So I wanted to just go over some very quick developments in the last week, just to lay out some of the material that we could use for our discussion, in addition to Francis Boyle's interview. Mark Curtis, a British historian and a journalist, he did some more research into this integrity initiative, which has been revealed in the last few weeks, which we're learning more and more about this. It's something that we could have all imagined existed, but now we have proof of it. The British government has admitted it exists. It's a supposed charity based at an old mill up in Scotland, but in fact, it is a network put together of intelligence and military officials, government officials in the UK, academics and journalists. They're supposed to be countering Russian disinformation, but what really it looks like they're doing is concocting the Russian threat, the narrative of the Russian threat, and smearing people like Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn. It's quite interesting that a Tory-run, and it's funded by the Foreign Office. So a Tory-run Foreign Office is funding a group that's attacking a Labour leader. This is what passes for democracy in the United Kingdom right now. But what Mark Curtis discovered was they not only went after Corbyn and others, but they went after Julian Assange as well. And I think this is very disturbing. As Curtis writes in a piece that was published, I think, today, the 28th of December, he writes the UK government-financed integrity initiative managed by the Institute for Statecraft is ostensibly a counter-information program to challenge Russian information operations. However, it has been revealed that the Integrity Initiative Twitter handle and some individuals associated with this program have also been tweeting messages attacking Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn and Julian Assange, WikiLeaks publisher. About Assange, Curtis writes, many of the same individuals attacking Corbyn have also been tweeting false statements about Julian Assange and Russia, trying to link the two. The Integrity Initiative Twitter site itself retweeted a Guardian smear article saying, quote, U.S. lobbyist for Russian oligarch visited Julian Assange 9 times last year, referring to a lawyer, Adam Waldman, visiting the WikiLeaks founder. It also tweeted, if you still believe Assange is some kind of hero, you deserve pity at best. Anders Aslund, another one of the members of this initiative, has tweeted that Assange, quote, represents certain Russian agencies, that WikiLeaks, Assange, and Snowden are nothing but highly successful Russian special operations and Kremlin agents, and that Assange, quote, is collaborating with Russia today as a program host, would be strange if not full-fledged agent. But first of all, Julian has not had that show on RT for a number of years now. He's clearly not appearing on RT because he has no connection anymore with the outside world when the Ecuadorian government shut that off back in March. The idea that you go on RT and you're a full-fledged agent, well, that is just doesn't even deserve comment. It's so ridiculous. Carol Caldwell, I think she's a Guardian journalist, has also sought to overtly link Assange to the Kremlin. She's tweeted that, quote, Assange and Seamus Milne, a Guardian columnist, are both Russia propaganda tools, and that Assange is a special friend, quote, of Russian intelligence, and that WikiLeaks, quote, has colluded with the Kremlin. In addition, Cadwallader has tweeted several times that, quote, Assange was in direct communication with Russian intelligence in 2016 and, quote, WikiLeaks sought assistance from the Russian intelligence offices to disrupt the U.S. presidential election. This is the entire narrative here that's being pushed without any evidence to link Russia with WikiLeaks and Russia having supposedly hacked, according to only an indictment, no proof in an indictment by Mueller that will never see the inside of a courtroom, that Russia hacked the emails and gave them to WikiLeaks. And as Ray McGovern has pointed out last week and other times, Barack Obama himself said just before he left office that they had no evidence to show who gave these hacked or stolen or leaked emails to WikiLeaks. One other point I want to make is that the defense team for Julian Assange has formally filed a request for precautionary measures or protective measures before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, considering that Assange requires urgent intervention because of seriousness of his medical situation that could become irreparable damage. Now, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights has already come out in defense of Julian Assange some weeks or months ago. So they will probably come out with something in his favor, but this is not very impressionable to the Ecuadorian authorities. Last week, we heard, as I mentioned, from Jose Rivera, the Ecuadorian journalist, that Julian lost his appeal about his connection to the outside world. To restore that, and an appeal to the highest court is unlikely to succeed because that court is not independent. Lastly, former Ecuadorian President Rafael Correa, who indeed was the one who gave asylum to Julian and defended him and gave Ecuadorian citizenship to Julian Assange, did a video interview in the last day or so, and he said that Lenin Moreno, the current president, quote, not only defies our obligations as the state that gave Julian Assange asylum, not only international human rights he defies, but also the Constitution of Ecuador, because Julian Assange has Ecuadorian citizenship. Those are words of the former president of Ecuador. Before we bring in Francis Boyle, I want to know if Ray has any comments on any of that, and then I'd like your comments after we hear from Francis.
Thank you, but I have no comments. I'm eager to hear Francis.
Okay. So, Joe Booth, if you have that ready to roll, why don't we show our audience the half-hour interview I did with Francis Boyle, a professor of international law at the University of Illinois. I interviewed him earlier today. Well, we're joined now by Francis Boyle. Francis is a professor of international law at the University of Illinois. We're speaking to him from his office there in Champaign, Illinois. He's been an advisor to the Palestine Liberation Organization, and he's also had experience, amongst many other things, he's had experience with an extradition request by the United States to Great Britain, and that's why we're welcoming Francis in tonight to talk about that. Welcome, Francis. Thank you for joining the online vigil for Julian Assange.
Well, thank you very much for having me on, Joe, and I simply commend you and Consortium News for staying on top of Assange's case. This is critical for freedom of speech, freedom of press, journalists all over the world.
Well, I thank you for that, friends. It certainly is. You're absolutely right. So tell us about your experiences working on a case of an extradition request the United States made to Great Britain.
Right. Well, first, John, I do have to say I am not involved in this case. I don't represent Assange. I'm only speaking for myself here in my personal capacity as a professor of international law. But yes, I was involved, spearheaded the campaigns to defeat the U.S.-UK Supplementary Extradition Treaty of 1986 by Maggie Thatcher. And I won't go through all that here, except that we castrated that treaty. And then second, after 9/11/2001, the British government re-tendered the original Maggie Thatcher extradition treaty in 2006 to the Bush administration, who accepted it. So working with my brother, Jerome, who's a lawyer in Chicago, we organized every Irish-American group in the country, as well as the ACLU, to fight back against this treaty. And I won't go through all of that work here, because it is and can be found and documented in my book, United Ireland Human Rights and International Law. And I wrote it up expressly for lawyers to use in order to defeat, here in the United States, requests for extradition by the British government, especially of us Irish. Now, to make a long story short, we did fight back in the 2006 Supplementary Extradition Treaty. We were unable to castrate it. We were sold out by Irish American officials, like Joe Biden and Chris Hedges and others in the Senate. But we did get fall back basic human rights, civil liberties protections for Irish and indeed all people in the United States. Regretfully, and for whatever reason, the same thing was not done in Britain. I guess because the Prime Minister at that time was Tony Blair. He was said to be the Human Rights Prime Minister, which, as we all know, is a joke and a fraud. He controlled Parliament, and Parliament enacted domestic implementing legislation for the 2006 extradition treaty, exactly the way the British government wrote it, which is completely totalitarian. Under the terms of this treaty, in the event the United States government makes a request for extradition for Assange, it is going to be very difficult for his lawyers in Britain to prevent that extradition. And as a matter of fact, my guess is they will probably have to go and appeal immediately to the European Court of Human Rights to prevent his extradition. But under the terms of the treaty itself, it's going to be very difficult. And indeed, given the practices under this treaty, which I have followed because we were able to get commitments in writing from the British that they were not going to use this treaty to go after Irish liberation fighters from our War of National Liberation against Britain going back to the 1916 Easter Rebellion. And so I have followed the extradition practices under this treaty. Basically, the way it is set up, here in the United States, we've been able to get almost everyone we have asked for under that extradition treaty, though I recently sent to you the first major exception to that might be of assistance to Mr. Assange, but that's it. By comparison, when the British have pointed out that, this is unfair that here in the when a request is made by Britain here in the United States, under the callback protections we got for everyone here, it's not automatic. Whereas when the United States makes requests to Britain, up until this latest exception I just sent you, it has been almost automatic. Indeed, it's basically a political process under the treaty, if I remember correctly. And again, understand, I'm just going here off the top of my head. I have not researched this issue with respect to Mr. Assange, because I'm not involved in this case. But the decision to extradite is purely political, made by Home Secretary. Well, we know the fact that Theresa May's Home Secretary will just turn him over immediately as soon as she can to the United States government once an extradition request is filed. Here in the United States, they tried to do the same thing to us by saying it would be automatically determined by the U.S. Secretary of State. We fought back to get that put into the control of the United States Federal District Judge, where it had been under the previous treaty that we castrated. So that's, again, what is the danger here facing Assange the moment he steps out of that embassy. The British lawyers will have to insist that Assange not face the death penalty here in the United States, that there'll have to be written guarantees from the United States government to that effect. The British lawyers will have to insist and get written guarantees from the United States government that he would not be prosecuted in the kangaroo courts in Gitmo, which, of course, they have threatened to do. But even if the British government were to give these guarantees, if Assange got here to the United States and was actually tried in Article 3 court, he would be subjected to a clear-cut kangaroo court proceeding, found guilty, sentenced to life in prison, and probably stuck away in one of these supermax prisons that are designed to drive the prisoners insane. And indeed, there's documentation by human rights groups that that's exactly what these supermax prisons do. So it's a very dangerous situation for Mr. Assange. I know his legal team there in Britain is first rate. I don't know all of them, but the lead counsel Garzón is the very distinguished Spanish investigative magistrate, and they had better have their papers already drafted in advance, and if necessary, go prepared to go all the way up immediately to the European Court of Human Rights to get a stay of extradition, which they can't do. The European Court of Human Rights will give provisional measures of protection. Now, the other danger here is this, however. that even if that were to be done, the British government could also decide to deport Assange back to Australia, since he is not a British citizen, he's an Australian citizen. And then the Americans could try to get him under the U.S.-Australian extradition treaty. I haven't read that treaty. I don't know what, if anything, it might say. But if that were to happen, then he would be outside the jurisdiction of the European Court of Human Rights, which Britain is still subject to now, prior to Brexit. Indeed, after Brexit, it seems they'll still be subjected to the European Court of Human Rights. So there we are today, Joe. He's in my opinion, very serious physical, mental danger, even putting aside his de facto incarceration there in the Ecuadorian embassy.
Well, let me ask you a couple of questions about the European Court of Human Rights. You said that, are you saying that it is a superior court to the highest court in Britain, that it can overrule even a judgment of the highest court?
That is correct.
Wow.
As I said, I just sent you the first case ever where now it's called the Supreme Court in Britain,
right,
ruled against an extradition to the United States. That was a major breakthrough. Assange and his lawyers could very well use that. But this has been so highly politicized in Britain, too. Courts pay attention to what the government's telling them to do. So they very well could lose in the Supreme Court of Britain. I want to make it clear, I'm not a licensed practice law in England. I can't predict, what the British courts are going to do, one way or the other. But yes, they can need to prepare immediately to take his case to the European Court of Human Rights, get provisional measures of protection to prevent his extradition to the United States while the case on the merits go on. Provisional measures of protection would be like a temporary restraining order. It does not resolve the issue on the merits. Now, on the merits of the case, sure, there are large numbers of arguments that can be made in the European Court of Human Rights against Assange's extradition, that this would violate his basic human rights under a variety of provisions of the European Convention. Now, if you look at the memorandum I submitted against this treaty to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, that was unrebutted by any expert on the side of the British, I outlined all the objections to the treaty for violating the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, to which both the United States and Britain are parties to. The United States is not subject to the jurisdiction of the European Court of Human Rights, so I certainly was not going to argue that to the United States Senate. But the protections in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights are pretty much the same protections as found in the European Convention on Human Rights. And I go through article by article, human right by human right there as a roadmap for all the rights that, his rights that would be violated. And of course, you have officials in the United States government that would threaten to kill him. And try treason or something like that. Well, he's not a citizen of the United States. He knows no loyalty to the United States. But again, this is really for his British lawyers to decide how best to proceed here. And then they also have to consider this deportation to Australia, escaping the jurisdiction of the European Court. And then you'd be in Australia, and right now they have a right-wing government there too. So who knows what would happen in Australia?
Yeah, we see here clearly the relations between the U.S. and two of their Five Eyes partners, Britain and Australia, especially when you described how it doesn't work in the same way both ways. In other words, when the U.S. asks for somebody, they almost always get them, and when Britain asks for someone, they don't necessarily get who they want. The Lori Love case, I think, is the one you refer to.
And I did want to point out, we have almost always gotten everyone we've asked for.
Yeah.
Even the Brits tried to sell this as anti-terrorism, and the Bush people did. But what happened is we used it to go after all their City of London fraudsters. And we got all of them. Even though we said originally we weren't interested in these types of people, we were interested in terrorists. And they were, and I have no brief for City of London fraudsters, banksters or financial swindlers or anything like that. We got all these people. And
you did
first
mention
exception is what I said to you, and that's it.
But you did mention one case where the UK denied an extradition request, and that was for, I believe, Lori Love, who was a hacker who was wanted in the U.S. So that was a great victory. But the Assange case, of course, is far different than that because of all the implications of the many, many government secrets he's revealed and many, many very angry, powerful people around the world who want to get him.
Right. Let me elaborate on it. Yes, that's an important precedent. But as you correctly pointed out, the political dimensions of this problem do not compare. As far as the United States government is concerned, Assange and Snowden are public enemies number 1 and 2. And, a hacker is a hacker, regretfully one way or the other, but the political implications there are almost nil. Yeah. So this, the political pressure here, I suspect on the British Supreme Court would be to, authorize the extradition of Assange.
Now, I'm a complete layman here, so forgive me if this is an obvious question, but does someone have to be actually in custody in order to be extradited to another country? What I'm saying is, if he's arrested on this bail skipping charge, it's unlikely he can get more than a few months for that. That's really a minor charge. Could his lawyers wait it out and that he's freed from that and could not be then extradited? Or would the British authorities take that into consideration when sentencing him, if indeed he's convicted? He's not even been charged yet, but if he's convicted for bail skipping.
Well, the moment they have custody of him, the U.S. can file that extradition charge, and that would be that, and they would just waive any prosecution for bail skipping. Right now, it seems to me Assange's best strategy, and again, I defer to his British lawyers, is to wait it out in that Ecuadorian embassy. Hopefully, the Tory government will fall. Corbyn will come to power. The Labour government, there will be a Labour Home Secretary, and then a campaign could be brought to bear on the Labour Home Secretary not to extradite Assange. That might be the best strategy.
So you mean when the U.S. files an extradition request, he could be held in the U.K. under those conditions? Under U.S. prosecution, he could be held in the U.K. pending extradition. Interesting.
That's correct.
I see.
That's correct.
You might
the moment he walks out of that embassy, that's correct. And he is actually physically taken into custody by a British law enforcement authority, yes.
So he could stay there until this is resolved one way or the other, the extradition request. Now, if they go to Europe, I think that 30 European MPs last week filed a petition or a statement in support of Julian Assange. So given that that's not a lot, 30, but it's more than we have in the UK, and certainly here in the U.S. Congress, is the political atmosphere in Europe sufficiently different, in your opinion, to give him a chance to win in the European Court of Human Rights?
This is something I discuss with my students in my international human rights law course. And today, I think you get a fairer shot, certainly in the European Court of Human Rights, than you would either in the United States Supreme Court or the UK Supreme Court, yes. It wasn't always that way, but I believe it is today. And even if it would first perhaps start out with a panel, and then they could move for a grand chamber of all the judges. And at that point, certainly when it gets into the European Court of Human Rights, I think you're going to need a grassroots public relations campaign, not only in the UK, but also in the EU and in the European Parliament, yes, in support of Assange, because he has been so thoroughly vilified that public opinion needs to be educated and turned around, including the judges. Yes, that has to be done. I mean, all judges everywhere in the Supreme Courts read the pages in the newspapers and pay attention to public opinion polls. But right now, I believe he's going to get a much fairer shot in the European Court of Human Rights than he would in the UK Supreme Court, and certainly not in the US Supreme Court, where, you have 5 Federal Society judges on there, the 5 horsemen of the apocalypse. So, obviously you'd have to appeal there, but you're not going to get anywhere. They couldn't give diddly squat about
it's 17 hours.
Let alone Assange's human rights.
Well, Francis, I just want to ask you one more thing before we let you go. I don't know how much expertise you may have in the Espionage Act, but as we probably can assume, he has been charged. The U.S. government has admitted that. They're not releasing the details yet. That's tied up in a court here in Alexandria, Virginia, where I am. So we may or may not get to see what the details of the indictment or criminal complaint. But it's been assumed that it's under the Espionage Act. And my reading of the act is from the original 1917 Act, in the Wilson administration, it made clear that only acts committed on U.S. territory or the high seas could be prosecuted. That, unfortunately, was changed in 1961 in an amendment that made it global. So this could be anywhere in the world, because Assange, of course, committed acts of publishing outside the United States. And there's also something in the original act which says that even mere possession or or dissemination of classified material is actionable, can be prosecuted. Of course, Julian has never been accused of stealing the documents himself, but only of accepting them and publishing them. But the Espionage Act has never been used against a journalist for political reasons, because it appears to conflict with the sentiment, at least, of the First Amendment. There were some, of course, after the Pentagon Papers case, the Nixon administration could have gone after both the Post, the Times, Senator Mike Gravel, who published it in a book. They could not do prior restraint. That's what the Supreme Court decided. But after publication, they could have prosecuted, but they didn't, because politically it would not be the right image for an administration to go after journalists like that. And there have been similar cases like that. So I want to know, am I correct in saying that he can be legally charged under the Espionage Act, as abominable as that act is, the way it's written? And for the political reasons have stopped him, but the Trump administration being so anti-media, maybe they would actually do this, which the Nixon administration wouldn't do.
Well, again, this is speculation what they're going to do. I don't know if they would request his extradition for prosecution under the Espionage Act for the reasons you have given. And because it then would open up this whole can of worms from their perspective. So they might request his extradition for common, ordinary, garden variety crimes, theft, misuse, things of this nature. And he, in theory, then could be extradited for that type of prosecution. However, if I remember correctly, under this treaty, the British government could waive the requirement of specialty. And the requirement of specialty is that you can only be prosecuted for the crime for which you are extradited. So they could get him over here under a variety of common, ordinary federal crimes that I'm sure they could concoct without any problem. And then once he's over here, the British government could waive specialty and then, in theory, prosecute him for violation of the Espionage Act. Now, I haven't studied the Espionage Act in a long time because I haven't been involved in cases under it. But as we all know, it was originally intended to do with spying during the First World War. Spies conducting themselves during wartime to get secrets. Well, okay, fine. We can agree on that. The First World War, fine. The Second World War. It was never intended to go after journalists practicing journalism. And yet there has been a history of administrations using and perverting the Espionage Act to go after journalists and to try to use them as a cudgel over their head. And, you know, given the Trump administration, that very well might be what they decide to do. They would want to set a precedent to use against investigative journalists, first-rate journalists, whistleblowers, and things of that nature. So we cannot rule this out at all, Jay.
Yeah.
But if we get this issue in the United States courts, I'm afraid, given the current Supreme Court, the five Federalist Society horsemen of the apocalypse will probably lose. So there it is. What can I say? So I agree with what you're saying, but actually winning these issues in the United States court will be, given the right-wing nature of U.S. courts these days, it's going to be very difficult to make progress with those types of arguments.
You know, the Act makes it clear that the death penalty can only be imposed in the time of war. So I could see them stretching out that the Afghan war cables and the Iraq collateral damage videos was a time of war. And that was actually exposing war crimes by the U.S.
That's correct. And so the British lawyers will have to demand that the British government get a guarantee in writing that Assange will not be prosecuted will not be sentenced to death. It's that simple. That is, even if he is convicted, they'll have to get that guarantee. And indeed, if not, they can go to the European Court of Human Rights and get that guarantee, get the European Court to order the British government to get that guarantee. Yes. But indeed, this treaty is so bad that if you read it, that someone can be extradited to face the death penalty, but could not be executed. So this was done deliberately and maliciously, Joe. So they could be over here, sitting on death row for the rest of their lives. Right. Although even then, the European Court of Human Rights, there's a very famous case, Soaring, saying the death row phenomenon constitutes cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment. So they could stop that too at the European Court of Human Rights. So these are, large numbers of issues. I want to make them clear. I have not investigated any of them with respect to Mr. Assange because I am not working on his case. A good friend of mine, Mike Ratner, did represent Assange in this country. And I told Mike I'd be happy to work on this case if he wanted me to. Unfortunately, Mike is going on to his reward, but I told his successors there at the Center for Constitutional Rights. So it's a highly complicated, highly charged, highly politicized situation. But my best advice is keep him out of the United States at all costs and tie this thing up over there at the European Court of Human Rights, at least until a Corbyn administration gets in there, and then launch a public relations campaign with Corbyn and the Labour Party on behalf of Assange. Right.
Thank you very, very much, Francis, for spending some time with us tonight.
Well, thanks, Joe. I'm sorry I can't be more enlightening. I'm just sort of giving you off the top of my head, and we'll have to see what happens.
I found it very enlightening. Thank you, Francis.
Okay, thanks, Joe.
Bye-bye now.
Yeah.
Back. I'm here.
Relations campaign with Corbyn and the Department on behalf of Assange. Right.
Thank you very, very much, Francis. Are we back? That was Francis Boyle, University of Illinois professor of international law. And I spoke to him earlier today from his office in Illinois, and he raised a number of new issues for me anyway. But let me bring Ray McGovern in, if Ray unmutes his microphone, which I asked him to mute before. So when we get Ray back here online, I wanted to ask him what his impressions were of Francis's remarks. For me, I thought his emphasis on the European Court of Human Rights was extremely interesting. Ray, you with us?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes. So why don't you weigh in if you have anything you'd like to say about what Francis, and I apologize, by the way, to our viewers for the quality of that audio, but I think it was still understandable. Ray?
Yeah, I could understand it. Now, Joe, Professor Boyle is no longer on the line, correct? We can't ask him.
No, that was a pre-recorded interview. That's correct.
Yeah. Well, let me just say this, that the notion that international or even national law would have anything to do with the case of Julian Assange if he ventured out beyond that door, I think is ludicrous. The way I look at it, and I've had considerable experience going back generations with the British, with the English, they're not to be trusted. And lately, of course, they are just a vassal of the United States. So it's really interesting to hear about how these appeals could work under the law. But the law is, as Alberto Gonzalez famously said, quaint, obsolete. He was referring to one basic law, of course, the Geneva Conventions. So suffice it to say that I think that it's a done deal. As soon as Julian Assange gets outside the door, whatever British pick him up, they're going to give him right over to the United States before anybody has a second opinion, so to speak. He'll be out on a plane and back. Now, what does this mean? Well, it means that the legal profession, with certain exceptions, and Francis Boyle is certainly one of those exceptions, has pretty much disgraced itself since 9/11. I mean, my father was a professor at law at Fordham University. He taught lots of courses. One of them he called Creditors' Rights, if any. Okay. Well, I was thinking of that listening to Professor Boyle, because he was talking about a course called Human Rights, if any. There aren't any when it comes to the United States or when it comes to its vassals. So in a way, it's good to hear all this. It's good to know how the laws could be applied internationally and in the European Court. But let that not distract us from the fact that Julian is completely vulnerable as soon as he gets out the door. One question I was going to ask Professor Boyle is this. Let's say, God forbid, Julian has appendicitis, okay? And the doctors refuse to operate in the Ecuadorian embassy, as I would imagine they would do, that is, refuse. Is there any international convention that could protect Julian while he's on the stretcher, while he's being brought to the hospital? Is there any diplomatic status that he would enjoy, or at least claim to enjoy, if that happened? I don't know the answer to that. Again, my answer would be it's probably academic. As soon as he's out the door, the British have him, and that's it. This is a sorry state of affairs. I mean, when you look at Alberto Gonzalez, now a distinguished professor in some rinky-dink university in Texas, when you see the other people, Bybee and other people who have actually tried to get on higher courts, none of them have been admonished so much or punished. And so it is my great regret that not only the intelligence analysis profession, the profession that could claim some right to objective analysis and searching for truth, at least back in the day, not only the press, which also could do that back in Watergate days, but also the legal profession, given what I've just said, and the church. I'm having a flashback now. I was at the Holocaust Museum in Tel Aviv, about 10 years ago, and there was a photo on the wall, and there were various tour groups coming in, and this photo had the generals saluting, the jurists, Heil Hitler, and the cardinals were all there. Okay, now I heard the English-speaking guide come along. He said, "Oh, here's swearing an oath, personal oath to Hitler. There are the generals, and there are the lawyers." And he started to move away. And I said, "Wait a second." He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Wait a second. Who else do you see in that picture?" "Oh, yeah, the cardinals." Well, you know what? If people in this country look up to religious authorities for any moral guidance, they die of thirst. And in that sense, it's not very different from what happened to the Catholic and the Lutheran Church in the 30s in Germany. They could not find their voice. And in this case, of course, Julian, is just too controversial. Even torture is something that very few of them will speak about. So I guess I'm jaded, and I'm consoled by the fact that people pretty much realize this, that Julian has to stay put. And the good news, of course, is that those Bundestag representatives last week, and I'm just hoping that those watching here, those who have ties, I have a lot of ties in Ireland, why don't we get other parliamentarians to descend on Julian, give him some hope, give him some backpacking, which I think he richly deserves, and tell him he's not alone. That way, he won't lose heart, and hopefully he won't get appendicitis either.
You'd wonder whether they would even let him be treated before they extradited him. Well, I mean, you gave some very sobering thoughts there, Ray, about what Francis had to say. And he was just speaking about the law and what the possibilities are. He probably, if he were online, well, I can't speak for him, but he might agree with you. And he did indicate that the situation is dire and not very hopeful. But that the one hope was to try to get that extradition hearing sent over to the European Court of Human Rights. Now, I mean, they have to have some kind of court procedure for the extradition. Now, it could take, what you're saying is it would take 5 minutes, basically. Yeah. They'd bring him in and they'd bang the gavel and he'd be on a plane to the U.S. Is that what you're saying?
They would know ahead of time and he'd be gone. So his lawyers would know better than I, certainly. But when you take the totality of what's happened to the law and how, well, take Lord Goldsmith. Who's he? He was the British Attorney General before the attack on Iraq, the US-UK attack on Iraq. What was his opinion? Illegal. Gross, flat out illegal. And Tony Blair invited him in to dinner and talked to him. And guess what? He changed his mind. And he said, well, I guess it's legal. What happened to him? Well, I don't know how you get, be above Lord Goldsmith, but he's the Earl of Breckinridge or the Grand Muffin of something right now. In other words, he got promoted. So that's how bad it is. And what are these British lawyers that have been referred to? Please give me a break. And again, I hate to harken back generations to my uncles and my cousins and my grandfather. But we know what British justice is like. And I think you've heard me say this, Joe, but for those who haven't, my grandfather sat me down and he said, now, Raymond, do you know why the sun never sets on the British Empire? I said, oh, sure, I know. He said, you don't know. No, you don't. I'll sit you down and I'll tell you. I said, okay. He says, the sun never sets on the British Empire because the good Lord would never trust the British in the dark. Well, so that was drummed into me, but I have to say that the last, 18 years or so, where Tony Blair and the others just acted like poodles, real poodles, trained poodles, persuade me that they will do the bidding of whatever president is in power in the United States. Then Brexit makes it even more complicated, but I'm sure they would salute, and Julian would be on the next plane west.
What you're saying is what a rare individual Julian Assange is in the midst of this sycophantic time we're going through, where everyone is simply looking out for their own skin and their own careers.
I was encouraged by the report that came out after the visit of the Bundestag members and John Pilger. Apparently, despite everything, and everything is a lot for Julian, he's in fairly good mood, decent shape. He's been incommunicado pretty much since last March. That's a long time. And if Pilger says, and I trust Pilger above all, that he's doing all right, and that's very encouraging to me. What I wish is that the British and the Ecuadorian authorities would at least be as compassionate. It's a hard word to use, isn't it? Compassionate as the Hungarian communists were when Cardinal Mindszenty had to flee into the U.S. embassy there. He spent many, many years in the embassy. They let his mother come several times a year. He had a nice little suite there. It was a problem politically and diplomatically, but the Hungarian communists treated Cardinal Mindszenty a lot better than Julian Assange is being treated by the Ecuadorian and, by extension, the British and U.S. authorities.
At the end of the interview, Francis mentioned that that a grassroots campaign is necessary. So while there aren't people, professional class people, let's say, lawyers, journalists, intelligence professionals, who have the courage and the guts, there are a few, very few, to speak out, to do the right thing. What about amongst the general public? I think there might be many more, because Julian's revelations are really in the defense of the general public and against the elites and the establishment that supports it and all those professional lackeys. How do we get them out? This is the perennial question we ask on this vigil. How do we get people out on the street? How do we make them understand that it's in their interest that they defend this man? And even the journalists, as you pointed out in a piece you wrote for us at Consortium News way back when you found out about those judges, about the judges on the West Coast. I heard the speech from the number 2 legal counsel at the New York Times, that the Times doesn't really, they can't stand Assange, but they don't want him prosecuted because it's going to hurt them ultimately. Even in that case, the journalists and the editors and publishers, knowing full well what the consequences are, they're still kind of muted. We see a few pieces here and there, but they're not coming out full-throated in defense of Assange, which could certainly help him enormously. As Francis pointed out, judges read the newspapers, especially politicians read newspapers, and have their finger all the time in the air to see how the public is going. How do we get the people on the streets? There was today a first action outside Harrods in support of Julian. In fact, there was his name, the name's Free Julian Assange, in candlelight on the steps of the embassy. I believe that was this evening. I saw a photograph on Twitter. So I'm going to throw you the impossible question, Ray. We're trying to do that with this vigil. What other ways can we get some damn interest of the public to come out there and to march for this man?
Yeah. Well, this is the challenge, of course. I would point out that the media is key. What we have now is a caricature of what Edmund Burke, a British statesman, got up in Parliament and said, look, there are 3 estates here. There were 2 houses of Commons in those days. There are 3 estates here. and we do a service to our citizens. But there's one state more important than all three of us together that is up there in the balcony. The men, all men in those days, of the press. Because without the fourth estate, none of us will be held accountable. Okay? That's a rich tradition. The fourth estate. Now, the fourth estate, I used to say it's moribund. It's dead. It's not like the Princess Bride says, you know, it's mostly dead. Oh, it's dead, okay? And so how do we create something in the nature of a samizdat? This is what the Russians became nourished on when their controlled media wouldn't tell them what's going on in the world. How do we create the kind of thing, and the alternative media is, of course, starting to do this, but how do we get people in London, let's say, to realize that this indignity is happening right in the middle of London, that this man is being held, according to the UN, in arbitrary detention, 2 separate UN decisions, and yet the British are thumbing their nose and saying, well, we're going to just, and the Ecuadorians the same. So it's encouraging to me to hear that there was some motion outside of Harrods. It's an excellent location to do things. The people who shop at Harrods will be bringing back their gifts that don't fit. And, no, really. And so I would suggest that next weekend, your idea, Joe, of the pots and pans, very rich tradition, Latin America and elsewhere, the pots and pans, and more than just a few. And who knows, maybe if there were 100 next week, there'll be 1,000 the following week when people wake up and find out what is going on in the center of London, right before their faces, all because the UK is acting as a poodle, as a vassal of the United States, and the United States just doesn't like war crimes being exposed. You know, one thing.
I wonder why. Yeah.
I add one thing that not many people know. There's lots of cause for U.S. deep state people to hate Julian Assange, right? There's not only the logs from Iraq and from Afghanistan and the diplomatic cables, but there's the fact that Ed Snowden would be in jail now in maximum security had not Julian Assange risen to the occasion and said, no, I'm going to call in all my chits out there in the back east. And Sarah Harrison, you go to Hong Kong and await instructions. And I don't know exactly how he orchestrated it, but the fact that Ed Snowden got out free and is able to function, albeit in Moscow, is due to Julian Assange. Now, the deep state knows that. Not many of us do, unless we've seen the film, or at least we follow this closely. So they hate him for that, for sure. But they also hate him because he has this incredible, this...
The back of my car, phone numbers in the book. He said, I'll ring 5 a day and get permission first. I haven't heard back from you. He's going to ring you to get permission. I said,
Dave, Father Dave. Okay, he was unmiked. Go on, Ray. Go on.
Okay. Yeah, the other thing is a more proximate cause, as we used to say in scholastic philosophy. And that has to do with something called Vault 7. Now, we're starting to say Julian has this incredible capacity to receive leaks. Now, I don't know how he does it, but these are not hacks, okay? Hacks, ipso facto, are collected by the NSA. They know about hacks. They collect them, they store them, they have metadata, they can get them right away. They can retrieve them, okay? These are leaks. What are leaks? Well, you put a little thumb drive into your computer, right? And you copy things. You can copy them at great speed. You take that thumb drive out and you get it to Julian or one of his lieutenants. Now, why do I say all that? Because that's how the DNC emails got to Julian Assange, and we can prove it forensically, okay? And by the principles of physics, one of them called fluid dynamics, okay? Now, what about what about Julian getting this stuff? Well, if they can't prove that he actually solicited it, they're trying to say that he got the emails from the DNC via Russia, right? Now, as you said before, Joe, the President of the United States, Barack Obama, said there's no evidence to show how the so-called Russian hacking got to WikiLeaks. Whoa, it's pretty big, huh? Pretty big hole in the narrative, okay? But he has this ability to get to this. So what does he get? He gets a thumb drive, or a couple of them maybe, with the entire retinue of offensive cyber warfare weapons that John Brennan and the CIA has created with the help of the NSA, where all that expertise existed before. Now Brennan's got his own directorate. His own directorate, that's several thousand people working on offensive cyber tools. But why do I mention that? Well, because one set of cyber tools that was leaked on a thumb drive to Julian Assange is called Vault 7. And Vault 7 was revealed by WikiLeaks in March of 2017. What did it say? Well, Julian said, first of all, I've got a treasure trove that dwarfs all the information that Ed Snowden brought out into Hong Kong. Imagine that. And I'm gonna release it in stages. Okay. Here's the first one. It allows a computer, a little tool to take control of your car, make it go 110 miles an hour, kill you. Okay. Brakes don't work. Here's another one. You think your TV is off in your bedroom? It's not off. It's recording everything you're saying with whomever you're saying it with, okay? Now, those were two that were duly reported and reflected in the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal. But then on March 31st, this is really interesting. On March 31st, all of a sudden, I get a call in the morning. Hello, this is RT from Moscow. Could you come in? I said, well, what's going on? Well, we'll send you an email. It's about Vault 7, something called Marble Framework. So I read the thing. My God, what is it? It's a cyber tool that allows you to hack into a computer or server, disguise who hacked in, and leave little breadcrumbs, leave little telltale signs in 5 languages they worked in: Russian, Chinese, Persian, Farsi, and Korean. Russian, Cyrillic. Oh, wow. So this tool would allow John Brennan to hack into, say, the DNC and disguise blame it on somebody else, this entity called Lucifer 2, and leave telltale signs like British formats. So not British, but Russian formats. The name of the first Russian head of the Cheka, the KGB. Well, you don't have to be a crackerjack analyst to say, this could be very damaging. So what happens? I say to the RT on the phone, okay, I see, I'll come in, but you're not even open yet. Well, we're going to use the Eurovision studio. Can you be there by 9? I said, okay, for the cause. So I'm driving down the carport lane all alone, risking arrest. And I get in there just before 9. And on the way, I say, now, Ray, what are you going to say? So call Bill Binney, ex-technical director of NSA, the National Security Agency. I say, Bill, I've been reading about this Marble Framework. It looks very suspicious to me. I'm on my way in to be interviewed. What do I say? So Bill says, look, Ray, I was there when they started this, he says. I was there when the CIA and NSA started working on these tools. Tell them this, Ray. Tell them this. There are 700 million lines of code. So McGovern, history major, says, that sounds like a lot, Bill. Bill says, yeah, right. Ray, look, can you still do multiplication? I said, yeah, I can. He says, each line of code costs $25. Do the math, Ray. Tell him that. Okay. So I did the math. We're talking billions of dollars, right? So I go in, I'm interviewed by RT. Nobody else is interested in interviewing me. Another outlet does, and another local TV station. But So what am I saying here? I'm saying that that was really big. Now, what did that indicate? That indicated that Julian Assange has a treasure trove of information that the CIA really, really, really would wish not to be divulged. Has he divulged all of it? Not in my, I don't know for sure, but if he said it's more than all that Ed Snowden brought out to Hong Kong, that's a lot. So what am I saying here? I'm saying that Julian has a certain leverage here. He hasn't released it all. And indeed, Julian's lawyer got in touch with a Justice Department lawyer working for the CIA. Justice does the lawyering for the CIA. And the Justice Department lawyer said, okay, look, what does Julian have and what does he want? And his lawyer said, well, you know what he's had. Check with your CIA client. He's got a lot. And he's willing to divulge the technical information that shows who did not hack. Whoa, who did not hack? And in return for that, Julian would like some measure of security, some immunity, so he doesn't get wrapped up. Okay, so what happens? The lawyer for Julian hears that Senator Warner, Mark Warner in Virginia, is interested in this. And so he gets in touch with him. He said, would you like us to ask Julian or Zola or something? Warner says, no, thanks very much. Boom, calls up, get Comey on the line. Jim, Comey, did you notice what's going on? No. Okay, shut it down. They shut it down. It was already shut down at the end of March after 2 months of painstaking negotiations. That's when Julian let loose with the Marble framework. Now, I'll just conclude here. The significance of this, of course, is that you don't have to be a conspiracy theorist. All you have to be is a all-source analyst like me to connect the dots is a trite way of saying it. But if you're looking for information on who Lucifer 2 is, and you don't know, and you can't get the FBI to look at it, but he turns up in these circumstances where these breadcrumbs from Russian Cyrillic are found. Well, it doesn't take a crackerjack analyst to put 2 and 2 together and say, as Bill, Binney, and I both suspect, can't prove, that Lucifer 2 is John Brennan. It's the cyber tool people that do this kind of stuff. And if that's the case, you can imagine how much John Brennan and James Clapper and the rest of them all lust after Julian Assange being put in deep, deep, deep security, isolated from the rest of the world for the rest of his life.
Well, Ray, I just want to say it was not my idea, the pots and pans. It came from someone else that Susie Dawson put forward. Alberto Gonzalez was George Bush's top legal advisor, and then Attorney General. We had Father Dave here, but I think he's escaped us. Father Dave, hopefully we get him right back on the line. When you mentioned before, Ray, that you saw that painting or photograph at the Holocaust Museum, and there were the cardinals, the man of the cloth, and they were going along with the Nazis. I thought Father Dave would be a good guy to comment on that, because here's a man of the cloth who is a supporter of Julian Assange. Father Dave's an unusual character, I would say. He's a parish priest and a professional boxer. And here's a quote from him. My hope is that there will be a great coming together of all people of faith around our core values of compassion and the value of human life that will naturally lead to support of Julian and WikiLeaks, all people of faith. Father Dave, welcome to the 10th online vigil for Julian Assange.
Thank you, brother. Can you hear me okay? Yes. I'm not sure if the microphone's too good here.
It's okay? Loud and clear, yes.
Good.
Apologies to Brian Becker and John Kriok. It's loud and clear, yep.
Thank you, brother. I'm out in that bush at the moment, so I'm in the middle of nowhere. So for getting reception, it's a bonus.
Where exactly is nowhere? Somewhere
nowhere. the middle of New South Wales, the bottom of the Blue Mountains National Park, for those who know their geography. Basically, we're, 40 minutes drive from the nearest town. So we're right in the middle of nowhere.
Oh, good.
This is where I think if we can get Julian out here, we can hold him up out here. Nobody will ever find him.
So I was about to say something similar to that. They won't be able to get you tonight if you say something amiss here. So tell us a little bit about
when we have more sensitive meetings. This is where we hold them.
Well, now you've blown it because you're telling the whole world about it. But I shouldn't have asked you your geographical location.
There's a million kangaroos here.
Lots of kangaroos, and good thing I didn't ask for the coordinates, so maybe you can still escape them. Tell us a little bit about how you know Julian Assange and your relationship with him. That's
a good question. I mean, I've been an admirer and supporter of Julian's for a long time. Obviously, he's a truth teller. My history goes back to my friendship with Mordechai Vanunu back in 1986. So really, it was my friendship with Morty which opened my eyes to the whole reality of whistleblowing and the importance of that. But, yeah, and I guess in the light of that, I was a strong supporter of Julian from early on. I then became good friends with his father, who was part of our parish for some years before moving into state. And I continued that friendship. And he introduced me personally to Julian when we went there together in a few years back to London, and continuing to support him as best I can.
How did you get to meet Vanunu, the man who exposed the Israeli nuclear program? How did that happen?
How long have you got, brother?
I've got an hour and a half, so go on.
Okay, it'll take about that long. He wandered into our church one night. I was working in a church in King's Cross. I was a trainee priest at that stage. And it was 1986, I think. And let me see. Yeah, that's right. And I was running a Friday night coffee thing, mainly for local sex workers. And we had all sorts of persons wandering. King's Cross is the red light district of Sydney. So I was running a sort of late Friday night coffee thing for people who'd wander in. And we had some very colourful characters. Morty wandered in as a Jewish backpacker and just started looking around the church building. And then we ended up chatting out the back, and we both studied philosophy at university, and we ended up getting into deep existential conversations. We both studied continental existentialism. And in the middle of King's Cross, having these deep discussions about Nietzsche and Kierkegaard that led to an ongoing friendship, which is still there. I was there when Morty was released in 2004. That was one of the times I've been closest to getting myself killed. And I've maintained contact since. So at the moment, he's very deliberately not contacting foreigners directly because he gets penalised for that. So I communicate now through his brother and through intermediaries. But it's still a very difficult situation for Morty. But, yeah, we became good friends back in 86. We were doing Bible studies together. He joined the church there. He was baptized. And I still remember he came to the front of the church. He said, now I give my life to Jesus. Now I do what I must do. And he made that decision that he was going to share the story. Up to that point, I remember he was very scared. He said, they may try and kill me. I didn't have a clue. I was a young guy. King's Cross, he met a lot of funny people. I didn't take it that seriously. Looking back, I only wish I'd gone with him to London, when he, which was where he was abducted from. Yeah, look, I'll stop. I could go on. But, yeah, our friendship was originally over philosophy, and the philosophy tied into a lot in Kierkegaard and Nietzsche about the importance of making decisions, critical decisions, difficult decisions. And in his case, he had a difficult decision to make. And the process of it, he made the decision.
So that's a whistleblower that you knew before you then learned about the existence of Julian Assange through his father. And then how did your... Well, before we go on, I got to ask you how you almost got killed. You can't just mention that without giving us a little detail about that.
Oh, sorry. Look, during Morty's 18 years of imprisonment, he did 11 and a half years in solitary. And, I published a book of letters he wrote me during those 11 and a half years. You can just see him deteriorating mentally. It was just terrible. But in the later years, he started to, grow again in strength and mental. He came good. And I'd said every letter I'd sent him, I sent him a letter every month during those 18 years. And I said to him every time, I will be there the day you're released. And I envisaged it being a bit like a scene out of the Blues Brothers, where Jake gets out of prison. It's just his brother Elwood there to meet him. I just thought it'd be me and maybe a couple of his brothers. But it was chaos. It was chaos. There were thousands of people outside the prison, and we were packed shoulder to shoulder with helicopter gunships flying overhead and a police cordon holding us back. And I remember being pressed, and they were all singing, all these guys, thousands of them, here we go, here we go, here we go. I was told the translation was slit his throat, drink his blood. These were all settlers. They wanted to kill him.
Jeez.
And it was a very, very hostile mob. And when Morty eventually, he ran to the gate, I still remember he put up the peace symbol and people howled. And then eventually he drove out in an armoured car with a police cordon following him, and then our cordon broke and it just degenerated into a riot. And I escaped that part of the riot, but then I had someone interviewing me, a French journalist that was, a woman, and all of a sudden we were surrounded and settlers again, and I had people, I couldn't, I was completely surrounded, and people were hitting me and kicking me and spitting on me, and the only English I could make out was "Go home, you bastard." But no, I don't know if I said "you bastard." Mainly it wasn't, and I really thought I was going to die at that point. And I remember I put my hands together like in prayer. I thought there's nothing I can do here, and someone reached in and grabbed me in the square of the back and pulled me out of the middle of that body pile and pushed me in the direction of my bus, and I kept walking.
Wow.
And I've got nothing what happened to the woman who's in the middle of that pile. But yeah, I figured that was I really thought that was it for me at that point. But somehow, by the grace of God, I survived that one. And Morty is still there. The problems continue.
And you mentioned that his mental Sorry, you mentioned his mental and physical.
I didn't want me back.
Yeah. Sorry, you mentioned that his mental and physical conditions were deteriorating in isolation, and Julian Assange has been essentially in isolation now since his network. Yes. So, when's the last time you had contact with Julian? We had John Pilger on last week, and he told us he went to visit him just a couple of days before that, so that was a week and a half ago. And he says he's in remarkably good spirits. So, when's the last time you had contact with Julian?
Oh, it was a couple of years ago now. What was it? It was Easter Day. I remember that. 2015, I think. Yeah, it was Easter Day, 2015. So April 2015. I know I think his dad's with him at the moment, which is great. So he does have contact, thank God. The reports we're getting from his mother and others are saying that he's deteriorating physically, and I hope that's not the case, but I believe. I mean, I don't know how he's managed this long.
So why are you, as a clergyman, standing out in favor of Julian Assange, and why are so few other churchmen and women doing the same as you?
Well, I think that's the real question: is why isn't everybody doing it? I mean, it just appalls me. It appalls me that we don't have, the entire institutional church from the Pope on down standing in solidarity with Julian. And if we did, I would see something happen. All I can put it down to is just the whole reality of institutionalization, that companies, corporations, institutions, whatever they are, once they get to a certain size, they become slave to the same sorts of laws, and the bottom line kicks in, and
well, if
it's corrupt.
If any pope were to speak out for Julian Assange, it would probably be this one. He's been quite outspoken on a number of issues, but
yeah, I'm waiting for him to take the lead. I think if anyone's going to do it, he's the guy. He's got integrity. He's got spirit. He's been so impressive. But mind you, I haven't heard a lot from him lately, and I'm not Catholic, of course, so I'm not directly in the loop.
That's the reason that he's not going to listen to a Protestant, so forget about that.
He would.
I'm sorry. I wouldn't have even asked.
Great guy. I think he's the guy to learn this. he's the guy to lead us forward. I really think something has to come from the religious community. I mean, I think you quoted me before, but I think from what I can see, every successful, really broad revolution has a powerful religious dimension to it. You know, you think of the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King, you think of the Iranian Revolution, the peaceful lead up to the overthrow of the Shah, and the role of the, the broad religious role of the religious community in that. You think of Mahatma Gandhi, and the way he tapped into the spirituality of the nation. Mm-hmm. I think we need to tap in broadly.
Martin Luther King.
Spirituality of people, be they Christian, Muslim, Hindu, you know what I mean? I think really a joining in of hands of some of these religious leaders, or even if not the leaders, is broad joining in hands at the grassroots level is what we need if we're going to see real sustained change that's going to take traction.
That's a very good point.
And when I go to Iran and places like this is what I talk about. I mean, I'm no one to lead it, but even here in Sydney, when the university students or the Socialist Alliance hold a rally for Gaza, 100 university students come. When the mosque community holds a rally for Gaza, 5,000 people come. We've got to tap into these broad spiritual communities somehow, I think, because they're there. They're there, and because despite the corruption at an institutional level, there's still, I think, a broad values, that are shared at the grassroots, values and ideals which can't be easily eradicated. And I think that's where, ideally, for Julian, I mean, for Palestine, for Syria, for any number of other things I feel strongly about, I think this is where we need to join hands religiously across the traditional boundaries, Catholic, Protestant, Muslim, Hindu, whatever. And we've got common ground here, for God's sake. Literally, for God's sake.
Yeah. Well, coming from you, you're absolutely right. That's a good point you made about Mahatma Gandhi. You could add Martin Luther King to that as a religious leader who had enormous political impact. Do you have any hopes of the Archbishop of Canterbury coming along? I doubt it, but have you thought about writing to him?
I don't think it's. I have no direct. I can't. Forgive me for saying, but I can't even get through to my own Archbishop in Sydney. So I've tried multiple times there.
Well, the Queen is the head of the church.
No, I went in. Yeah, look, maybe but like we've got very close to home things we could act on. Like you might know, last year I went and I did break into the detention centre on Manus Island here, where we keep all our asylum seekers. A terrible situation. I went there and I've just come back from Papua New Guinea again last week. This time I was boxing, but again, associated with the asylum seekers there. Now, as I said to my bishops, come with me. If one of them would come with me, or the Archbishop himself, we could end the thing overnight. We really could. We could, but they won't do it. I don't know why, except you get caught up in the institutional framework.
Yeah.
Now, if they won't, the Queen, they're not going to.
The lesson for me, if I could interject here, is that it really is up to us. It's up to you, and you've done it. The bishops aren't going to come along. And so once we're freed from this expectation that the institutional church, whatever faith it is, will live up to its leadership qualities and prerogatives, then I think that's a freeing thing. One of my favorite theologians is Annie Dillard. Perhaps you've heard of her. And she says, there are enough of us. There are enough of us, and there never has been any more than a few to start things out. So I guess that's the lesson I've learned. I've worked for women's justice in the Catholic Church. Didn't get much progress there, but at least over the long haul, you'll see that it will help. And I like I.F. Stone, who famously said, you have to go into this with open eyes, as you are. You have to expect to lose, because you're going to lose, and then you're going to lose again. And then one fine day, someone who thinks the way you do wins. You have to expect that, and you have to keep the faith, so to speak, but do it without waiting for permission or even encouragement from the from the hierarchy. That's what I've learned, at least.
Well, thank you, Ray. I'm going to bring in Scott. Yeah, Father, I want to bring in Scott Horton, but Father Dave, you want to respond to that?
No, just 100% right, Ray, and I appreciate your encouragement, frankly, brother. And I should be thankful for the fact that my Archbishop and bishops let me rip. Basically, they don't try and silence me, and I don't take that for granted. I've seen other cases like my friend Stephen Sizer in London, who's very outspoken on Palestine, not supported, and shut down by his own superiors in the church, and that hasn't happened to me. They've been very gracious at that level. So, yeah, you're right. I got to keep coming forward and doing it.
You, Dave. Nice meeting you remotely.
You too, brother. You too.
Please, Dave, if you could stick around for the conversation, we'd love to keep you here. Scott Horton is producing for a number of years a radio program on antiwar.com. I think he runs under his own production now. Scott, we haven't only been talking about religion tonight. You came in when we did. We started off with an interview with Francis Boyle, who's been, I think, a guest on your show. I know Ray has been, and so have I, of course. And Francis was talking about the extradition treaty between the U.S. and Britain and how dire the situation is for Assange. And he was saying that the only chance his lawyers had were to go to stall and bring it to the European Court of Human Rights, which actually has jurisdiction over the British Supreme Court legally. And that if that, to evade that, the British may want to deport Assange once they get him to Australia, which is not subject to the European Court of Human Rights. And then from there, the Australians could extradite him to the U.S. But Ray McGovern, who just left us, threw a lot of cold water on that, saying he thought that within hours of being arrested, he would be extradited to the U.S. We would just go to courtroom for 5 minutes, and the lawyers wouldn't have a chance to really mount any kind of argument against extradition. So then we brought Ray on and Father Dave. So Scott, tell us about your background with Julian. I think have you ever had him on your show when he was able to speak to the media?
Yeah, I interviewed him twice back in, say, 2010-ish era, around the time of the Manning leak. So, yeah, now, as far as the extradition thing, that's the other Scott Horton, who's the international human rights lawyer. So, I don't really know about that. But if I had to bet, yeah, I would say Ray is probably right that, the law doesn't have much to do with what's going on here. It's really only kind of tradition and ceremony that's keeping a SAS SWAT team from going in there and grabbing him and renditioning him to America as it is right now, right? There's no law preventing that. There's no judge in a white wig preventing that. It's just there's not a political willingness to go that far as of yet. But
there is the Vienna Convention, if I can interrupt. The Vienna Convention makes the territory of an embassy the national territory of that country, and it's inviolable to the local authorities. So they can't go in without Ecuadorian permission. But they're right. They can do that tomorrow, and they want to do that tomorrow. But it's just the image that would portray, not that they're breaking a law.
Yeah,
that it would look pretty bad if they let that
if they could get the Ecuadorians to kick him out of the embassy, then I think Ray is right that they'd have him on a plane to Virginia before he had a chance to appeal to any European court. And I don't know if how exactly it works in the UK, whether they would respect the ruling of a European court, mandating that he not be extradited or something like that. I mean, that sounds kind of far-fetched, but Professor Boyle knows a lot more about that than me. So maybe they could do that. But I mean, just think of how absurd this whole conversation is, that if we were having the same conversation about, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a good one. Say Mark Mazzetti. I don't want to say David Sanger, but let's say Mark Mazzetti from the New York Times, who published some classified information. But this time, instead of it actually being a very official leak that they wanted him to publish, this was something that they didn't want him to publish. And so let's go ahead and put him in prison. Now, the thing of it is this. The law in America says that they can do that. Woodrow Wilson's Espionage Act says that they can do that. Right. It's only tradition so far that they haven't crossed that line. But Absolutely. The Espionage Act does not differentiate between the leaker and the leakee. And so if you're a reporter at a newspaper and you publish classified information, you're just as criminally liable under the law as the government employee who broke their secrecy agreement in order to give it to you. If you look at the Pentagon Papers case, in the Nixon years with Daniel Ellsberg and all that, the only question before the court there was prior restraint and whether the government could prevent the paper from publishing the stuff in the first place. But they didn't answer the question of whether the reporters could be locked up for doing their job. And that was punted. It was a more narrow issue. So as of now, up until this point, no American journalist has ever been criminally prosecuted. I think some of them have probably been run off the road, but I don't think any have been criminally prosecuted for publishing secrets like this. And in the Obama administration, they absolutely wanted to crucify Julian Assange, but the Department of Justice lawyers came up against what they called the New York Times problem. And Glenn Greenwald has written at length about this. I think the Washington Post originally ran the story about it, that if we prosecute Assange, then essentially we can prosecute the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Miami Herald. Any reporter who publishes a government secret could be liable under the Espionage Act in this way, or at least on national security beat reporting. I don't know how far they could try to twist that, but they didn't want to go ahead and break open that dam and those floodgates and all of the consequences that would flow from there. So, you like Assange and I like Assange, but they've made enough of a hate figure out of him among the mainstream media. I mean, a lot of it is just jealousy in the way that he's taken this entire new 21st century approach to journalism that has really showed them up and showed a lot of them for who they are. I mean, remember Ken Danilian from NBC and the LA Times got busted just straight carrying water for the CIA and checking his articles with them. Here's everything that you told me to write, and here's what I wrote. Do you like it? And all of this stuff. Busted by Assange. So here they've created in this image of him where he's the perfect Judas goat, where if they can destroy his right to publish, then they can set that precedent on him. They couldn't do that to Scott Shane or Mark Mazzetti. You'd have the rest of Washington, D.C. and New York City would rally to their cause. But when it comes to Julian Assange, these people are willing to cut off their own nose to spite their face. They don't like him, and so they're willing to essentially turn the other way. I mean, think about this. Julian Assange, in this case, the possible extradition, and we know now it's right. This is the context of the discussion here, is it's been leaked now, presumably accidentally in court papers, that there are secret charges. We thought there were for a long time, and then we found out there weren't in the Obama years. And then now there are secret charges in the Trump years where they're going after him. This ought to be the absolute biggest cause celeb among all of media and all of Hollywood, all those so-called, hashtag resistance liberals and progressives who, have Trump in their sights. This ought to be a thing where they are all rallying around and making the biggest deal in the whole world about a literal threat to the traditional way that we've implemented the First Amendment in this country, and a huge sea change in the legalities of national security journalism going forward. And they won't. Instead, they sacrifice him. They push him off the cliff in our First Amendment with him because they don't like that he helped get Donald Trump elected by publishing Hillary's emails. And now none of them ever have to answer, well, how come Hillary's emails didn't help get her elected? How come the emails didn't prove what a great Secretary of State she was? What a great First Lady she'd been? What a great senator she was? All the great things that she believed and was going to do for us. Instead, they revealed the Goldman Sachs speeches that they fought like tooth and nail to prevent the American people from seeing. And why? Because it's full of how much she hates us. She talks about in there how you have to have two separate policies. One, that's your real policy, and the other, that you explain to your Goldman Sachs friends, and the other that you sell to the American idiots out there so that they'll give you power to use against them. And she's just as blatant as can be. So they don't ever have to answer why. I mean, just in principle, why wouldn't we all celebrate the publishing of those emails as a great journalistic feat? But in this case, it really hurt Hillary. And so they're willing to throw the entire First Amendment away over it. It's really a tragedy.
Oh, there's no doubt about that, Scott. I completely agree with you, what you said about the Espionage Act, that it can be used to get him. It's the way it's written. The dissemination and possession of classified material is enough. In the Pentagon Papers case, actually, some of the majority opinion, while they ruled against the prior restraint against the Nixon administration, they did say that after publication, you could be arrested. And actually, as you very rightly point out, it's been political tradition because it would make any government look bad to do that. So they held off prosecuting the Post and the Times afterward. And Senator Gravel, when he published the Beacon Press edition of the Pentagon Papers. But this administration, being as angry and hateful of the media as Trump is, and he has some good criticism of them, but he's gone over the top. You were absolutely right. Why isn't the resistance crowd rallying behind Assange? Because he's a target of Trump for his attacks on the media. No, they only settled for the guy, Jim Acosta at CNN, for being told to shut up and having his credentials pulled at the White House. That was something to protest, but Assange is a far more serious matter for press freedom. And we hear nothing from them. And it's really disturbing. I could say that.
Yeah. Well, and it's always going to be the case, right, that a Jim Acosta type event, which is, basically just gossip kind of nonsense, a little fight there. That's really simple and easy for anyone. You just look right at it, you come up with your hot take and you tweet it out, and now you're part of the conversation. Whereas if you really want to get into WikiLeaks, you might have to have been paying attention for a little while in a row, maybe do some research, read some articles, figure out where you stand. On one hand, he did really help to expose the truth about the Iraq and Afghan wars of George W. Bush, and so I appreciate him for that. But then, geez, on the other hand, sure don't like Donald Trump. So WikiLeaks' effect on the election in 2016, I don't think anyone would say that she lost despite WikiLeaks leaking her emails, which helped her a lot, pretty much, you have to weigh these things, talk about them with your friends, maybe smoke a little pot and have an in-depth discussion, do some reading, talk with someone else who disagrees with you. But Jim Acosta, you can just look right at that and point your finger and gawk and have your opinion. So even for example, Chelsea Manning cuts a very, sympathetic character to the progressive left, right? This transgendered person who was intimidated by his father into joining the army and didn't quite fit in, and then leaked all these secrets. Yes, it was during Obama years, but he was basically, Chelsea, was ratting on George W. Bush, right? Was telling the truth about Bush's wars in Iraq and Afghanistan more than anything else. There's a lot of State Department stuff in there about Hillary too, because it was the leak came out in 2010, right? So it was, both, but especially it was Bush. And on, real leftists and some very principled progressives like Glenn Greenwald and so forth rallied around Manning. But by and large, not so much, because really, if you're going to talk about Manning and the importance of Manning and what Manning did, the sacrifice that Manning made to bring us all that stuff, you got to read all that stuff. You have to know what it is and why it matters. The Guardian ran a bunch of articles about the Wolf Brigade. Well, what's the Wolf Brigade? Now you're biting off more than you can chew. This is a lot to understand about Iraq War II. And if you don't know about it, then all these new cables, I don't know. I saw in the news that they made Bush look a little bad, but it's a lot for the average person to get their head around. So even someone who could really be a figure that they would put forward and really champion, like Chelsea Manning, gets kind of buried and ignored when there's just, easier kind of lower hanging fruit for them to rally around. It's the same thing with environmentalism, right? Where there are environmental problems everywhere and in your town. So you can look right at it and see it. But there's a genocide going on in Yemen, but you don't know the first thing about it, including where to even begin to learn about it. And so in a sense, a little bit of local sewage problem is something, Lord, give me the strength to focus on the things that I can actually do something about. And so people choose that. They choose something easy. Something nearby instead of the worst stuff that's more complicated far away. And so, Assange, if you have the principle of the free press at all costs in mind, then it doesn't matter whether you like Assange or not. It doesn't matter whether you ever believed those girls in Sweden or whether you didn't, or any of these things, because journalism is journalism, and the First Amendment's the First Amendment, and the truth is the truth, and the documents say what they say, and it is what it is. But for regular kind of news consuming people, TV news consuming people, that's just not the way they look at it. It's all a clash of personalities. It's all a clash of sides and teams and red and blue and partisan nonsense. And all the value, all the truth gets lost in that, Well,
aside from smoking pot, you really are asking a lot of American people to do all that research.
Yeah.
But that is the job of the media. That's supposed to be the job. I've been a reporter for 30 years, and I've always understood my job is to take very complex information and simplify it, and stick to the facts, and get to the essence of it, and present it in a way that the average American can understand why it's important to them, why it's important to the country, and they're not doing that, obviously. But you were right to point out also that Assange was kind of a hero when he was exposing the crimes of Bush. Once he exposed Hillary, he's become the demonized by the Democrats, and that just underscores the hyper-partisanship of the United States right now. Nothing I've ever seen before. Father Dave, if you want to weigh in on this very American conversation we're having here about U.S. politics, I'd be curious to know what you think about out there in the bush in Australia.
I'm not sure I've got anything to add, brother. I'm 100% behind what Scott's saying. Yeah.
It's really an important issue here in the U.S. because this is where he's going to be brought to be prosecuted under the Espionage Act, most likely, as Scott pointed out, and also if that would open the floodgates, because if the Trump administration prosecutes Assange, they can go after anybody else who publishes classified information. That's just about any major news organization. They do it routinely, but as also Scott pointed out very interestingly and importantly, they usually just publish classified stuff that's been leaked to them by government officials, by intelligence men and women who want them to want leaked information that's classified out there. And rarely do they go after the stuff that's critical of the government, which is, of course, exactly what Assange has done. And that is the job of the journalist as well, not just to be the mouthpiece of power, but to serve the people. Maybe I'm sounding too idealistic here, but that's supposed to be what the job's all about. And it's not that.
Well,
and Julian is doing it. Sorry?
Yeah, that's supposed to be about. No, 100%. And
the priest,
one would hope the church would fight up to the conscience as well, but again, we fail. Journalists fail. It just seems the whole system's fallen apart.
I have to agree with you on that, unfortunately. And it's all about sucking up to power, even in the church, as you say. It's the people and the mid-level people who can be trying to do their job, finding a way and taking risks on behalf of that. What is the point of becoming a priest? What is the point of becoming a journalist? You're supposed to be following a certain calling, and really both of those professions, if I can call priesthood a profession. And yet it's much easier to just shut up and try to politic your way to a higher, better position and just be safe, keep your job. But these jobs are not like other jobs where, you want to keep your job by maybe not criticizing the boss. When you're working in construction, it's not your role to have to make these kinds of decisions. But certainly in journalism or in the clergy, it is. And it's extremely disappointing to see so few people being able to speak out. And that's why we're glad to have the kind of people we have on this vigil, like Scott, who was always speaking out. When do you never not speak out?
When I'm writing, I guess.
Okay. Well, then it comes out in another way. We're at a critical time.
That's the positive side of it, too. We've got to remember that people continue to speak out. Despite the fact that the institutions are as powerful as they are and that we have the dominant narrative that seems to be all-encompassing, nonetheless, people continue to speak out. Like it says in the Gospel of John, the light shines in the darkness and the darkness has never managed to put it out. The light continues to shine. People will continue to speak. And eventually I think we'll find the right charismatic leader to rise up and harness the energy of the grassroots people around the globe and make a real change. But One can only hope that happens.
And become a target, most likely.
Oh, inevitably. I think that's part of the process. But, as we say, if you're not getting shot at, you're not on the front line.
Indeed. If you could remember back, Scott, about your conversations with Assange, what was the most impressive thing or important thing he may have said in those conversations?
I really don't remember that much. I know we talked a little bit about some of his early successes. He had leaked some stuff about the government of Somalia and some stuff about, I think, the Russians and some others. So I think we went over that a little bit, sort of to show that he had a broader agenda than just targeting the U.S. empire, that, he was really trying to create this outlet for, good people in governments all around the world to leak documents to show what their bosses were really up to. It's really the only kind of tattletales that we like in the world. It's the whistleblowers inside government. And the government sure don't like them, but what would we be without them? Where would we be? And so there was a bit of that. And I think we probably talked a bit about the revolution in Tunisia, breaking out, and in Egypt as the result of the Manning leak. And that's something that gets, washed away kind of, part of the time. But the news there at the beginning of 2011 was that the last few weeks of 2010, since the WikiLeaks came out, the media in Tunisia was going crazy over the revelations in the State Department cables about Ben Ali, and particularly about his wife's family, and how they were just stealing the place blind, and how here are the Americans who own him, basically, right? He's the American sock puppet dictator of the country. And yet the State Department people talk about him like, geez, would you get a load of this guy and how much he steals and how corrupt this is? It's out of control. So the people of Tunisia knew that, of course, already. But when it was in the WikiLeaks with the Americans talking about them that way, in that blatant of a way, in these secret cables, and when that really made the news, that on top of all the inflationary, pressures on very poor people living on $1 a day, now it's worth 50 cents, and their kids are going hungry. So there were major bread riots broke out. It's actually this one guy, he was a graduate student, or maybe he even had a graduate degree, I forget, a PhD, and had a vegetable and fruit stand. And the local authorities came and tried to tax him and destroyed his fruit stand because he didn't have the proper tax stamp and license and whatever. And he went and burned himself to death, Buddhist monk in South Vietnam style on the doorstep of the local bureaucracy there. And that was what kicked off the giant riot that kicked off the whole Arab Spring, because they chased Ben Ali right out of town and to Saudi Arabia. And then the people in Egypt unanimously, all of them at the same time said, you can do that? And they went outside too. And you had, all of Egypt, and Cairo and Alexandria and Town and Country and socialist labor types and the Muslim Brotherhood conservatives and everybody in between said Mubarak's got to go, and came out and overthrew the American sock puppet dictator 30 years. And of course, there's a lot of bad that came with the good, because the American and Saudi counter-revolution and hijacking of the revolution, crushing the revolution in Bahrain, hijacking it in Yemen and turning it into a genocide, hijacking it in Libya and turning it into not a genocide, but a horrible massacre and a state of permanent war there, and then co-opting and hijacking the Arab Spring revolts in Syria and turning that into an unmitigated nightmare catastrophe of the Islamic State and Iraq War III and all the rest of this chaos that, continues on to this day in Syria and Iraq. So, but I wouldn't blame that on Manning. That part of it, that's, the responsibility for that part goes on the Americans and the Saudis for their criminal behavior. But what Manning did was give the people of the region an opportunity to kind of all at once, in a way where it was really important to see that they had a chance to change the way that they live and the American influence over their state. And so
another reason
really
why the Americans want Assange, because Manning found a place to publish that, and that set off what you just described very well. And threw over two of their, as you say, as their sock puppet dictators in the region. But yes, there was that counter-revolution, which unfortunately succeeded to this point. But you have to wonder why this doesn't happen in the United States, and why the revelations about American criminality does not create the same reaction amongst the American people as it did amongst the Tunisians and then the Egyptians and the Syrians, etc. And I can only think that still the economy is strong enough that there are still enough people in the middle class who have a stake in the system. Whereas in Egypt, where I've spent a lot of time, I know that very few people have a stake in the system. So they're on the outs and they don't have any hope. So
a lot of Americans think they have a stake in the system when really they don't. That's the unfortunate part of it too. But, of course, I mean, they did, right? You did have the Occupy movement on the left and the Tea Party movement on the right. And what's that other than the left and the right saying, we are not Democrats and Republicans. We are not loyal to these parties. We don't like you, Clinton or Bush. I mean, in fact, you got to kind of hand it to James Madison a little bit where, I mean, we have been stuck with these guys for a long time. But just if you look at the post-Cold War era, I mean, they started telling us in 2013, 2014 that get ready. In 2016, your choice is going to be Bill Clinton's wife or George Bush's brother. And you're going to like it. And on the Democrat side, they went along with that. But on the Republican side, they were like, no, actually, we'll take the bull in the China shop before we take George Bush's brother. We're not going along with this. Now, I had predicted for years, it's going to be Jeb. It's going to be Jeb. Why? Because as you know, Joe, Hillary Clinton is the least electable human being on the face of the planet. And even Jeb, as uncharismatic as he is, would have stomped her. But I didn't see Trump coming. But I guess I should have seen that the American people, and particularly in the party out of power, really feel, if they don't know, they at least feel just how far out of power they really are and how little influence they have over this government. When W. Bush was in there, maybe they felt like he represented them and cared about them a little bit or whatever. But in Obama years, when they cannot identify with the ruling caste in power at that moment, and plus they really are a bunch of powerless schmucks who have no authority over the Republican Party or its policies at all anyway, they throw their hands up, they get angry. And in this case, they threw Trump in there. But, he was all they had, right? It's not like Rand was running as Ron out there saying you have a real choice. Rand was running as Jeb. So who else were they supposed to go for? But you know what? But they can always divert the left and the right off on these pet projects in America too, where, and look, there's a lot of hypocrisy. Don't get me wrong, but still, the George Bush rank and file supporters, when they came out calling themselves the Tea Party, that meant that and this was right at the end of the Bush years still, they decided they hated him. His approval rating was down 30%, and the economic bust came on his watch, and all these crazy deficits and all this stuff they don't believe in. And they really started out as like fiscal hawks, saying we got to get the debt under control. We shouldn't be bailing out billionaire bankers, just like Occupy, right? Why should billionaires get welfare and all? But then all it takes is the GOP to go, and just dangle abortion and Mexicans and scary Arab Sharia laws coming to get you and whatever garbage in front of their eyeballs. And off they go on their tangent. Obama was born in Kenya and usurped McCain's rightful throne and all these crazy things. And so the Tea Party became the nothing, right? They just became Republican voters again. And then with the Occupy left, and they could have been, I'll give them credit. They could have been like old-fashioned economic communists and, economic leftists, but instead, no, it's all about gender. It's all about race. It's all about pronouns. It's all about, basically a bunch of much less important issues than, really trying to take on power. In fact, somebody wrote a great thing about Noam Chomsky at Counterpunch recently about how, Chomsky is he looks at all this through an economic lens. Now, I'm a libertarian and he's some kind of anarcho-syndicalist or whatever, so we don't see these things the same at all. But he's looking at it from who has the power, who has the money, who controls the arms firms and the think tanks and the Congress and the banks and the centers of real power in the world, where the rest of the left is running around chasing their tail about what you're supposed to properly call somebody without hurting their feelings and all of this stuff and getting nothing done. And so that's, and also just look at the other guy, right? When you have the Tea Party guys, you just say to them, look at all the things to hate about the left. And to the left, you say, look at all the things to hate about the right. And then so leftists aren't really criticizing the Democrats for their part in the power. They need those Democrats to protect them from the Republicans and vice versa, And so I think when you live under Hosni Mubarak, you don't really have that dynamic, right? You have 30 years of stagnant dictatorship. And then you look around and you realize, hey, it's left and right against the man. That's it. It's us versus him. Although, you know what I think, and I'm not sure if this is relevant to our discussion, but I'm going to say it. It seems to me like right now, the liberal Democrats in America are making the exact same mistake that the more or less pseudo liberal Democrats in Egypt made after the revolution there. Because what happened was the conservatives won the election, and Democrats hate democracy when they lose. And so instead of saying, you know what, Muslim Brotherhood won, but just barely. And hey, we have, a new contract, a new constitution, regular elections coming soon. We need to build our party and build our activism, and better luck next time, and preserve this system. And instead, what they do? They went and camped out in Tahrir Square, said the revolution ain't over yet. They want the military to come and overthrow the Muslim Brotherhood for them because they hate the political right. The guys, the civilians in the political party who are willing to run for office and lose. The liberals decided they hated them more than the military dictatorship. And they created the pretext for the counter-revolution a year and a half later in Egypt, when the military came in and overthrew Mohamed Morsi and put Sisi in charge and recreated the dictatorship there. And that's the exact same mistake that the liberals in America are making right now, where they prefer the CIA and they prefer James Mattis and the military and anyone but the man that won the Democratic election to be the one making the decisions. And I mean, I think, frankly, they keep saying it over and over again, right? 25th Amendment. In other words, we want the cabinet to do a coup d'etat against the elected president. And presumably, up until a couple of weeks ago, they meant led by James Mattis, the Marine Corps General, Secretary of Defense. And they're falling into that same trap where they're willing to give into long-term despotism in the short term just to get rid of the guy that they don't like by the process that they ought to be thanking their lucky stars that they still have at all to oppose the guy next time, to have better luck, to not nominate a Clinton next time,
That's a very interesting comparison there between what happened in Egypt and what's happening here in the U.S. Another thing was that you mentioned Occupy Wall Street, where it began, and they were inspired by what happened in Egypt. Mm-hmm. So it came around full circle in a way. And I remember I had just come back from Cairo, and I was in New York, and I wanted to go down there I knew about this first night, and I regret I didn't go, but I watched it live online because they were streaming it. So it was directly an inspiration from the revolution in Egypt, in Tahrir Square in 2011. And that was started all by WikiLeaks, as you started before telling us, from Tunisia, yep. Skipped over to Egypt, and then inflamed the rest of the region, and then came around to New York, but it was also crushed by the police. We have to remember they did maybe veer off into identity politics, as you've mentioned, but they did start out at least, and I was down there, then I did go down several nights. It was about the bankers. It was about economic issues. Mm-hmm. And I think that's going to be the one that could fuel an insurgency in the U.S. And it began really in the 2016 election when both left and right, Trump on the right and Sanders on the left, scared the hell out of the establishment, which is why they are blaming Russia, in my opinion, for disturbing our election and dividing us all as if we're not already divided, because they have to team up to blame another hostile foreign power. It's the oldest trick in the book, going back to probably the beginning of civilization, when a ruling class is facing unrest because of their own policies, but don't, never admit what you've done, but blame somebody else. And that's the situation we find ourselves in. And it's something that's going to keep growing, I think. And the yellow vests didn't catch on in the U.S., but you never can predict these things. Nobody predicted that. It will spur. It might just come of its own, and we won't know when or how. But if we keep going down the road of this neoliberal policies that have robbed the people for 30 years since Chicago school ideas were implemented by Reagan and Thatcher, if that continues, and there's no indication that's stopping, and it certainly is being continued by Trump, then it's going to lead to a social explosion. I think they're very well aware of that. So they are making provisions. One might be having militarized police, which are supposed to not use that equipment that they get for free, equipment from the Pentagon for riot control. But we saw in Ferguson that it was indeed used for that. So we know that was a window into what could happen if there is an insurrection or an open rebellion on the streets of this country. Those police are going to be turned to paramilitary, just like the ones I saw in Cairo. After the violence, I was there and I saw all the tanks on the street. So we could see that here too. And
that should be just a nightmare because, the people, especially those who are radical enough to want to do the fighting on the right and the left, have no idea what they're talking about or what they want. So you have, these Antifa types on one side and, the so-called alt-right and worse type Nazis on the right. If there's a real riot, basically you just have these guys fighting each other. Nobody's taking on power at all. You just have the most radical leftists and rightists taking on each other that the rest of us have nothing to do with. And a bunch of people who, if they did have power, they'd be even worse than the people that we have in charge now. If for no other reason than they have no idea what they're doing other than reacting against the other side that they hate so much. So that's where I can imagine a really bad spiral, right, where things really just start getting worse and worse and worse. And then you have, as you're saying, the militarized police intervening on both sides between the two. And hey, the crash has already started. I mean, they raised interest rates 3-4 times in a row quite deliberately to cause the next crash on Trump's watch in order to get rid of him in the next election, which we were overdue for a crash from this crazy bubble anyway, from all the money they created last time. But they're like in a hurry to cause the crash now, apparently, it sure seems like. And you may fish your wish there, Joe. You may regret it, bud.
Well, Scott, we think alike because it was just crossing my mind that this downturn in Wall Street could very well be engineered to make a lot of people rich too, by the way, and also for political reasons to damage Trump. That has crossed my mind. I don't know if we could prove this one well, but you just said the interest rates went up and that could have the desired effect.
Yeah, and that's the Federal Reserve Board. They decide that. That's not the market.
Guess who Trump
raises
wants
rates.
To fire? He wants to fire the Fed chairman of the Fed. Right?
That's right. Yeah, the commissar of the interest rate raises it, and so
So maybe he knows what's going on. Maybe that's why he wants him fired. Who knows? It's hard to read that guy. Well, you talked about the Antifa and the alt-right fighting in the streets. It brings back, of course, the stark memory of the brown shirts and the communists fighting in the streets of Munich and Berlin and across Germany before Hitler came to power. And in that chaos, the corporations that had so much to do with the rise of Nazi in Germany and foreign corporations turned to a strong man. And that could also be a way, and not a strong man like Trump, who's really not that strong. He's kind of weak, actually. And he hasn't stood up to these guys. He's starting to now over Syria withdrawal, and look at the reaction again by the Democrats in particular about their love, as you correctly pointed out, of the CIA, the FBI, and the military, and all of a sudden, it's abominable.
Yeah. Well, lucky for us, all of our generals are a bunch of completely ridiculous goofballs and losers and scumbags. David Petraeus and Stanley McChrystal, all these guys who can do nothing but lose wars over and over again. So I'm not too afraid of them pushing the civilian leadership aside and seizing power, because I just don't think any of them. I don't think they could have held that parade Trump wanted in D.C. without all just crashing into each other and running into a ditch on the side of the road.
Absolutely. I was going to bring in Vivian Kubrick, but she's disappeared. So we're stuck together here, Scott. If this is the reverse,
man, I like you, Joe.
You're usually interviewing me, so I got a chance now to turn the tables here.
That's true. Everyone, you should check the archives of all of my interviews of Joe about Iraq War III, where he was, living in Erbil at the time in Iraqi Kurdistan. And, lots of great interviews of Joe in that whole era, 2014 through like 16 and a half, 17 there. Tons of great stuff there.
Well, thank you.
And more going way back in the archives. But
so let's bring in Vivian Kubrick. You're speaking to us from London. Is that right? You can stay on, Scott. Please stay on and join in if you'd like.
Yes, do. Wait a minute, I've got to unmute myself. Am I unmute? Yes.
You are.
Hi. No, I'm definitely not in London. I am in Florida with
Florida.
my dog. Yes.
You brought your dog. You put your dog on the plane.
Oh no! I live here, so
you live in Florida.
Yes,
I see.
Exactly.
I thought you were doing it from London. Okay.
Yes, actually, I would have joined you talking about joining a lot earlier, except I've been futzing around because I disconnected my router from the. I mean, I turned off my Wi-Fi because I've been reading so many hellacious things about how damaging it is to have like 5G Wi-Fi. So
¿Cómo imagina el futuro del señor Julian Assange, asilado en...
But I managed to turn it on, and here I am. But actually, while I was listening, I really wanted to just understand something, and you've had so many people who are deeply knowledgeable in the area of, intelligence analysis and journalists or whatever. But I just don't understand a really, really simple point. Legally, if Julian Assange has exposed crimes that, of course, are far more dreadful than anything anyone could accuse Julian of, I just don't understand why the crimes that he exposed doesn't exonerate him legally. Like, yes, okay, maybe technically he broke some kind of law, which we've all established that he really hasn't, because he's a publisher. And I was listening to your previous guest saying, well, this is like the New York problem or whatever it is, where, if you...
New York Times problem,
yeah. Yeah, the New York Times problem. Is that surely, if we're talking about in the spirit, right? In the spirit of the law, surely a far more terrible crime what would be the right word? Exonerates the person that exposed it, maybe exposed it to the point where people feel like that was irresponsible, let's say. But now that he has exposed it, why isn't he exonerated? Because the crimes that he's exposed are so serious. So, like I say, I'm just very, it seems like a very simple point to me, but clearly one that doesn't carry any weight, which I don't understand. And,
I have a couple answers.
Oh,
First of all, that's why they hate him so much, is for exposing those horrible crimes. And so that in no way mitigates to them. That's the reason to hang him as high as they possibly can. But then second and worse is that, and we're assuming, we know he's been charged now, I think, but we don't know exactly with what. But presumably he's been charged under the Espionage Act. And the Espionage Act specifically says that no argument that you were doing it for a good reason will be entertained at all. It cannot, it's written in the law where, and I think the courts have ruled as well that a defendant may not say, but I was exposing a crime. You're not even allowed to mount that defense.
All right, I've got to interrupt. Okay, so constitutional law is the supreme law of the land. In other words, it supersedes everything else. Now, the constitutional law says that you are not permitted, I remember John Kiriakou saying this, that you are not permitted to make secret anything that exposes a crime. Now, as the Constitution is the supreme law, I don't understand why that law isn't being enforced, because it doesn't matter that those bastards are just trying to get rid of someone who's, to put it mildly, is embarrassing them. He's endangering them. So what I just don't understand is, where are the people that are supposed to enforce constitutional law? I don't know enough about how Congress or, the Supreme Courts work. Where are these people that are supposed to go, hang on a sec, you've committed a giant fucking excuse my language. You've exposed a terrible crime. Wow, this is so serious that we're now going to cut across any, lower judicial courts, and we're going to enforce the constitutional law, which is supreme above all the laws. So I just don't understand why that isn't happening.
Well, I could just say, Vivian, that it's because it's not a legal question as you're framing it, but it's a political question. So, of course, those people who were exposed for committing war crimes should be prosecuted. All the Americans who took part in torture that broke American and international law should be prosecuted. Obama said we're going to look forward. We're not going to look back. What does that mean? That even the crime of torture cannot be prosecuted when it becomes a political issue. And all those people that you're asking, where are they, are in charge, they're part of the system, and they're not going to buck that. They're not going to disturb the system because it's good for them.
Well,
so
actually,
they're not going to do, yeah.
Sorry, Joe, to interrupt you, because I seem to be incapable of not interrupting people right now. Sorry. It would be very helpful. Earlier on, you were all discussing what could people do, and going outside Harrods is absolutely, a brilliant thing to do. But surely what we should be doing is looking at where we as citizens should go to, right? Like, I would like to write to, contact, whatever, the person that is actually responsible for enforcing constitutional law. Now, I understand that the Department of Justice is gone to hell, but at least there are positions, presumably, there are actual, hats people are wearing where they are supposed to be enforcing constitutional law. Now, is that the Supreme Court that's supposed to be enforcing that? Or is that any judge that goes, holy crap, they're breaking constitutional law? Because that's surely who we should be contacting and saying, hey, your job is supposed to enforce constitutional law. What's up?
Well, it's the Justice Department. It's the Justice Department that has to prosecute. And and as Binney calls it, the Just Us Department, not the Justice Department.
Yeah. Well, and the federal judges too. The judges, something like the hypothetical where you're saying, I think a judge would say, I'm not here to debate what should be classified or not. I'm only here. This case is about whether what he leaked was classified, not whether it should have been. That's somebody else's problem for another day. That kind of thing. They just
that's right.
back.
You know what we call that in England? We call that a jobber.
Yeah. That's exactly what it is.
I could think of a few other words you could use as well. But I could tell you this. I just want, Scott made a very good point about the lack of public interest defense. Now that we're talking about Britain. In Britain, you can, as far as I understand, mount a public interest defense. That yes, we publish classified information, but it was in the public interest. You might lose, but you cannot say peep on the stand about why you did it. Now, Dan Ellsberg was with us 2 weeks ago, and he told that story that he got on the stand and he wanted to explain why he leaked the Pentagon Papers. Judge cut him off. He was being prosecuted on the Espionage Act, just as Scott said. Cannot say a word about your motive, which is usually a very important part of a criminal case. Motive, but not when it comes to the Espionage Act or any national security matters in a courtroom.
Can I say something?
Sure, come on in. Tell us who you are. Tell the audience about yourself.
Hi. Yeah, I'm a journalist who have been covering on issues of Julian Assange and also explaining public what WikiLeaks is and the significance of the organization. And antiwar.com has been very gracious to pick up my articles in the past. And
they're really great.
So I kind of like to comment on Vivian's question. And I think what we are having here is the crisis of Western democracy. And it's a crisis of system of representation. And then with that, we really don't have mechanisms to enforce laws. Because those in power, they get to write laws and interpret laws in a way that they want, and then prosecute anyone they wish, weaponize the outdated Espionage Act, for instance. So, we have to be realistic. I think we have to first come to terms with the fact that we really don't have democracy. And the Julian Assange's case is a really good example that really proves that this illusion of democracy. So, for instance, right after WikiLeaks released the documents relating to Afghan wars and Iraq wars, it was Pentagon already knew what was coming, and they had 20,000 people working for public relations trying to discredit WikiLeaks before WikiLeaks published the materials. And then US, and then right after WikiLeaks published the materials, they are the one who came up with strong narrative saying WikiLeaks has caused death. And the famous Pentagon lines of the organization has blood in their hand, Assange has blood in his hands, and which is not the case. And the US counterintelligence official who led the Pentagon's review into the fallout from the WikiLeaks disclosures of state secrets acknowledged under oath during the Chelsea Manning court-martial in 2013 that no instances were ever found of any individual killed by enemy forces as a result of having been named in the releases. So WikiLeaks released material never brought any physical harm. But then here again, it's the U.S. corporate media and then the Pentagon and U.S. government. I mean, they are the one who really create this fabricated narrative to demonize WikiLeaks. And this is not really the real legal case. It's a political case. So that they are trying to prosecute Julian Assange by persuading public who is a victim of basically this propaganda, who is kept ignorant intentionally about what this organization has done. And to, it's kind of similar to, I think, the illegal wars that the U.S. government has been engaged in. And all wars that the U.S. engaged in, it's started with lies, and public, it's basically lied into, right, to this wars. So, we have to, I think it's important for us to understand that what's happening is similar to this illegal wars. And just because this, this is the first war on the First Amendment, just because we don't seem to have this blood or the actual people who are killed like any other wars, so we tend to think that it's not really a war, but it is war. And this is an illegal war, U.S. government's illegal war. So I think it's very important for us to educate American people, educate people around the world about what's happening with his case, and then using his case as an example to show that what we have is a crisis of democracy. And the solution to free Julian Assange really have to come from public. And for that, obviously, we don't have effective court of public opinion because we don't have informed citizens. We don't have informed public who is very critical for us to have a functioning democracy. So that the question really is, at this point, what can we do to save Julian Assange? This system that we have, this is crumbling. And there is already alternative being built under the radar that we, many of us don't know, but there have been effort, by those who are using cryptocurrency like Bitcoin, for instance, or cypherpunks. They are already creating a new system, but Julian Assange gets stuck in this system, being kept unfree. So we have to use the whatever means available to find a way to free Assange. And for that, as a part of educating the public, I wonder why is it that, progressive media in the U.S., for instance, doesn't really pick up this Assange case and report on this. And for instance, on KPFA, which is a local radio station in Berkeley, right? The Pacifica National Board supported the resolution calling for the defense and freedom of Julian Assange, but the local radio station in Berkeley, they are not doing that. They refuse to support Julian Assange. And if anything, we are talking about Berkeley here. We are not talking about conservative state or anything. So why is it that the Berkeley, the city that is known for the champion of free speech, we had here the free speech movement started, for instance. And why is it that the people, why did the journalists in this city are not standing up for Julian Assange? That's for me a biggest question. And so we are going to have tomorrow, for instance, a press conference and basically protest and send a message to Berkeley local radio station board to start reporting on Julian Assange and stand up for the freedom of Julian Assange.
Well, those are excuse me, wise words from Nozomi Hayase, who is a journalist out there in Berkeley. And joining us also was Kathy Vogan and Ann Garrison, who works at KPFA. So, Ann, I wanted to bring you in here to just follow up on what Nozomi was telling us about that. If you unmute your microphone, which is always useful. Yes, if you want to be heard. Okay, Ann, yes.
Okay, it's not absolute. I report on Julian Assange on the KPFA Saturday Evening News. Dennis Bernstein does. So does Davey D. Yesterday, Davey D that's Davey D of Hard Knock Radio. He's a very popular host on from 4 to 5 in the afternoon. And he had Bruce Dixon of the Black Agenda Report on for an hour doing a year-end wrap-up. And Bruce talked quite a bit about Julian Assange and about the importance of his work for understanding what goes on in Africa, which of course they're concerned with. You want to say anything else about KPFA?
No, that resolution was passed, but it was a hell of a fight you had to undertake, wasn't it, by the KP board?
It wasn't really a big fight on the Pacific and National Board. That wasn't much of a fight. We had to rewrite it just a little bit, but not in any way that was too damaging.
But you would agree that it's lukewarm. You do a show, Dennis does a show, but I know from Dennis and from you that many of the presenters there on that station are closer to NPR than they are to the good old days of Pacifica. Would that be too much to say?
We've got people coming on, particularly on the KPFA Sunday show. It's a woman who's come on a number of times and said the CIA and the FBI are our friends. They're there to protect us.
Amazing. On a Pacifica station.
Yeah, and without challenge from the host.
You know, that's so sad because Nozomi was talking about really the old regime, or the ancien regime, as the French called it, really is dying in front of our eyes. But something new is maybe growing, as she said, with cryptocurrency. There are things happening we don't even know about that could be growing to replace that old order. And this is why I think we should stay positive about this too, because we are seeing something collapsing under our eyes, slowly as it is. But we want to see signs that something new is growing. And this is what makes the Assange case so important. Because if he could win, if he could somehow escape this prosecution and walk free, it would be an enormous victory. And I think that would create an incredible groundswell of understanding of the importance of what WikiLeaks has done and what this old regime that's dying has done as well, namely their crimes and their corruption. We have Scott, we've got Kathy Vogan, who hasn't spoken yet, and Vivian and Nozomi. Kathy, do you want to weigh in? Kathy's talking to us from Australia as well. You have to, in addition, mute your microphone. There you go.
Hi, I've just unmuted Joe.
Very good.
So, yeah. So I've been away for most of the last week, celebrating Christmas with extended family, but trying to keep in touch with everything that is happening. And I do recall, it wasn't last week, I think, but the week before, my thoughts exactly being articulated by you or one of your guests, might have been Mike Gravel, who said, put it this way, I was going to actually tweet it in these words, that America has to be saved from itself. And in that respect, the European parliamentarians, 36 of them so far, and now a UK parliamentarian, eventually the European court has the power to actually just put an end to all this. As John Shipton said, Julian's torture must end. Yeah. But the thing is that we do have still a very serious situation where things have gone right off the rails in Ecuador. And I've been working with Jose Rivera in the last day or so. So he sent me a link to a CNN publication of an interview with Rafael Correa, which was actually 6 6 days old before CNN decided to publish it. It's rather strange that they waited so long. But Jose kindly did the translation so that we could understand what's happening there. And I subtitled it. They are part of the interview that was with Korea about Julian Assange. It comes in the full interview, which is 31 minutes. It starts at about, I can tell you it starts exactly at 9 minutes and 47 seconds. So we've been working together, Unity for J as well, to get transcription in Spanish and the translation out, because what Korea says about Moreno's actions at the moment indicate that there is defiance of the law, the rule of law, on many fronts in relation to what is going on in Ecuador. Now, I don't know if that has been put across to Stream PC, but I can just play it off my desktop because we just finished last night. You are ready to roll? Can we look at that, please?
¿Cómo imagina el futuro del señor Julian Assange, asilado en la Embajada de Ecuador en la ciudad de Londres, con alguna perspectiva complicada, me imagino, para él, como consecuencia de cosas que hemos escuchado de parte del gobierno del actual presidente Moreno? ¿Cómo imagina esta situación para adelante? Siendo que es aparentemente evidente que eso va a terminarse pronto.
Con dolor le puedo decir que Julian Assange está condenado. En el alma de traidor de este presidente ya negoció su cabeza hace tiempo, ya se sabe la conversación que tuvo con Manafort, se ha dado ese testimonio en Estados Unidos. Usted conoce a Manafort, ¿no?
Sí, claro.
El asociado de Trump, acusado por 10.000 cosas en Estados Unidos, se reunió apenas asumió el mando en mayo del 2017 en Ecuador con Lenín Moreno, y dice una persona que estuvo en la reunión que fue Lenín Moreno el que propuso el tema, no Manafort, de entregar a Julian Assange a los Estados Unidos si Estados Unidos les daba ayuda a Ecuador, a su gobierno. Esto se ratificó con la venida este año del vicepresidente de Estados Unidos, donde, entre otras cosas, se negoció la entrega de Assange, también se negoció la impunidad para Chevron, también se negoció el aislamiento a Venezuela, y ni siquiera se negocia, porque estos son serviles por vocación, ¿no? Se propusieron aislar a Venezuela, destruir la UNASUD, etcétera. Propusieron voluntariamente hacer todo aquello, pero también la entrega de Julian Assange. Temo que los días de Julian Assange en la Embajada del Ecuador en Londres están contados, lo cual no solo atenta contra nuestra obligación como Estado por haberle dado el asilo, no solo atenta contra el derecho internacional y los derechos humanos, atenta contra la Constitución del Ecuador, porque Julian Assange ya tiene la nacionalidad ecuatoriana. Si usted pasa más de cierto tiempo en territorio ecuatoriano, tiene el derecho de obtener la ciudadanía ecuatoriana. El consulado, las delegaciones diplomáticas se consideran territorio nacional, tiene 6 años en la embajada en Londres, se le otorgó la ciudadanía ecuatoriana y debe estar bajo la protección del Estado ecuatoriano. Nuestra Constitución prohíbe la extradición, la entrega a un tercer país de nuestros ciudadanos, pero aquí están haciendo lo que le da la gana.
Okay, so I hope that our viewers got to read that, because it is really good. There are a lot of interviews coming out in Spanish, and if it's just a written article, a press article, we can get our Google Translate and keep up with it. But it's very hard with videos normally. So for those of the panel who've been in here and haven't seen that directly, what Rafael Correa is saying is that Lenín Moreno is not only defying the obligations as a state that has given asylum to Julian Assange, he is not only defying international law, and we're talking about refugee convention, other things as well, but certainly the working group on arbitrary detention has made it clear, and now European Parliament's letter as well, demanding that Julian be released immediately. But finally, that he is also defying the Ecuadorian constitution, because Julian Assange is an Ecuadorian citizen, and the law, Ecuadorian law, forbids any citizen full stop, from being extradited. So, you know, who's going to save Ecuador from itself? Because Julian's situation is just typical. It's typical of what happened to the vice president, Jorge Glass. He went on a 52-day hunger strike because he was just whisked off to maximum security prison and in a very remote location. And Korea has already told us as well there was no substantial evidence to support that action. We have learned from Rivera, our correspondent in Ecuador, that Moreno has put travel bans on much of the party that he was a part of, many of the party members who he worked alongside with, because he was in Korea's government as well. So there are very strange and arbitrary things going on. But also, you know, there is a question of money. Another point that Korea makes is that when Paul Manafort went to visit Lenin Moreno, that the deal was cut there, as well as immunity for Chevron and a deal around Venezuela as well. So, you know, we have these things going on at the top level that are entirely outside of the rule of law. Locally and internationally. So we keep saying, what do we do, Joe? But what do we do in these circumstances where WikiLeaks wins just about, I think, every case, in fact, every legal case, but still they're being hammered by rogues who seem to be above or consider themselves above the rule of law.
What a surprise. Absolutely right. Yeah, it's absolutely right. Rogues is the perfect word to describe how they behave, because they are not subject to the law. We're supposed to be living here in the United States. There's a very famous expression here that we're a country or a nation of laws, not men. There's nothing more full of it than that. I live here in the Washington area, and we've got monuments to men everywhere. If we're living in a nation of laws, not men, why are there monuments to men everywhere? Jefferson, Washington, Lincoln, for example.
Sometimes quite bad men, and we've got a lot of those monuments in Australia.
Bad monuments too, by the way. But yes,
bad monuments, bad art. But I just want to respond to Vivian as well when she talks about constitutional law, because Moreno has replaced the entire constitutional court. All of the judges are Moreno's people now, so he owns the courts of justice. When, I would suppose, Julian's case gets to that constitutional level, his objection to the violation of his human rights, you know, what chance does he have when the dictator owns the courts as well? What chance is there? We need to maybe think of something else. I see Ray McGovern isn't in anymore, but I bet he's got a few ideas. He's naughty.
Anybody? You know, I've been sitting here for some time thinking about how important it is to define terms, because we talk about political, and many people who are cynical understand political as meaning what it is, which is basically gangsterism, and, you know, Johnnies and their prostitutes. I mean, I keep wondering whether there's anything more disappointing as an answer than to say, you know, as human beings, we have to elevate ourselves spiritually enough to be brave enough. I mean, I was talking to Susie last night, and, you know, that woman has some serious bloody bravery. And, you know, she really is brave. And in the end, I think it does boil down to, who are the brave people? Where are they? Now, obviously, Julian is just, I mean, unbelievably brave, and the people that have worked with him at WikiLeaks, and everyone that, you know, tries to help him, because presumably it's not good professionally as a lawyer to find yourself in such a tremendous opposition to very, very powerful forces on this planet who could presumably do everything from put a bullet in your head to just kind of destroy your business somehow. And when I'm going back to the defining terms, I think that all the words that have been used around Julian have confused people who might otherwise support him. I mean, they've, you know, I mean, even the fact that they've attached this espionage, you know, this ridiculous charge of it being espionage, because I don't see how anything that Julian did, unless he actually was tiptoeing around inside, you know, government buildings, snatching papers, or actually physically breaking into computers himself. I don't see how that counts as espionage. What he is he's published people who have decided that what they've witnessed is so intolerably criminal that they're even prepared to risk their life, their job, and their liberty to expose it. Now, you'd think that the public would look at those words, i.e. a whistleblower, and immediately go, wow, brave person doing the right thing. And, you know, when I think of the people that have said to me, who you know, are friends of mine that I love, and they're not stupid or anything, they, in a very terrifying manner, accuse him of being a tool or a Russian agent or a man who is egotistically trying to stand up to people who are just trying to, you know, make the world a better place. Like, you know, I mean, the degree of gullibility, naivety, and lack of understanding is certainly our business as people that do understand, and all the independent journalists, which is why I certainly go maniacal about defending the people that have been taken off Facebook. And I know everybody has the thing about InfoWars and Alex Jones, but I personally learnt about all the things that Julian has exposed from Alex's guests and from the things that he talks about. Whether you hate Alex because of the way he talks about things, okay. But whenever he talks about what he's aiming for, which is also what Julian's aiming for, what all of us are aiming for, is a complete civilizational, you know, upsurging of freedom, you know, liberty, education, the truth, and getting rid of all these criminals. So really, at this point, I don't think we can pick and choose who we're going to support in independent media. We have to defend everyone on principle, but also because InfoWars has a bloody huge audience. It really does. And I think, Joe, you know, any of the people that you have, you know, that you're in contact with, I think you should all start, you know, contacting Alex and saying, please speak more about Julian's situation, because it's so, you know, it just like Alex being deplatformed and defunded and everything else. You know, Julian is also another individual that if we let him sink, then everyone sinks. And that's why it is so important to stand up for Julian. So if there are members of the public watching this and they're kind of scratching their heads going, but what can we do? You know, that is just it. These very few powerful people depend on everyone feeling disempowered. And so I think the most important thing is that we actually do figure out between us all, and I certainly haven't figured it out, who are the people that we should be pressurizing. And surely it would be whoever is officially in charge of enforcing constitutional law, because it can't just be a kind of a sort of a nebulous unknown quantity. There has to be somebody who is responsible for enforcing the supreme law of the land. So I would love to figure out who those people are. I really don't know.
Okay, I'm trying to jump in here.
Yeah, go on.
Okay, well, I did some preparation here, much of which I'll have to share next time. But I spent a day reading WikiLeaks. And once you do that, it's hard to stop. And in fact, I kept saying, I got to wash my hair. I'm going to be on the YouTube. But I never did. And I was particularly reading about part of the world that interests me, the African Great Lakes region, particularly the Democratic Republic of the Congo and its eastern neighbors, Rwanda, Uganda, and Burundi. And this is a case where I really needed Julian's help with this because when I kept reading them, before, I said, well, what? All the important years and dates are missing. All the years when things really happened, when it got really violent, when there were invasions and massacres. And when Julian was on RT, he was in an interview on RT on May 8th, 2011, he said, regarding the diplomatic cables, we had only secret, confidential, and classified cables. We didn't have any top secret cables to release, so people will see big gaps in what was leaked to us. Well, that explained a lot. And I went through and made some notes. Uh-oh, here's my cat, wants to get involved. Okay. Madeline.
I hope Vivian's dog doesn't see your cat, but anyway.
Well, she's a black cat. I'm wearing a black t-shirt, so you don't see her. But so I went through all the diplomatic cables about Rwanda, and lo and behold, they begin on March 7th, 1973, and end on December 26th, 1979. Well, that's the first batch of them. And what's missing is January 1978 to August 2000. Well, it was on October 1st, 1990, that a detachment of the Ugandan army led by Rwandan exiles invaded Rwanda. The Rwandan war then went on for 4 years until mid-July 1994. The Rwandan and Burundian presidents were assassinated when their plane was shot out of the sky over the capital of Rwanda on April 6, 1994. And let's see, later that year, Rwanda invaded the Democratic Republic of the Congo in November. No, that was, excuse me, that was not later that year. That was in November 1996. They massacred their way to Kinshasa, the capital, on the other side of the country. And then they invaded again in August 1998. And they've continued to plunder Congolese resources since. Rwanda is a tiny agricultural country, but it's now become the world's largest exporter of coltan, which is an electronics and defense critical mineral. So how could there not be any diplomatic cables from Rwanda from January 1978 to August 2000? And the answer that Julian has suggested, that he suggested in this RT interview, was that those cables were top secret and WikiLeaks didn't have access to them.
So we know nothing about the plane crash of April 6th that you mentioned from anything that was released by WikiLeaks. Those are top secret.
Not a word. Yeah. Not a word. And nothing about, yeah.
Makes sense from the government's point of view, obviously. That's highly sensitive information that in case somebody like WikiLeaks came along, wouldn't get their hands on. But it's curious to know who.
I have
yeah.
I have notes about the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which I can share with you next week.
Yeah.
Because we're running out of time.
We are. It's always Anne at the end for some reason that I have to cut off. But we do have 7 minutes left. So yes.
Wait, there's one thing I should be absolutely clear about. The Pacifica National Board actually passed a very strongly worded resolution in which they called for Julian's freedom. It was just the local KPFA local station board.
I see.
They passed a resolution so watered down that it didn't really mean much. They did not call for his freedom.
Yeah, it's very disturbing.
Yeah.
Kathy, you want to say something on Nozomi? Yeah, Nozomi, please.
I understand, but the KPFA, local Berkeley KPFA board members, they decided not to actually show support So they didn't, they didn't want to actually make any statement on his freedom. That's my understanding, as I was informed about. It was that, they refused to actually make a statement to show support for Julian Assange.
All they did was say they wanted to encourage programming. I mean, and there's some programming that's really bad.
As I understand that, they didn't want to make any political statement because they want to be neutral. They want to be more objective as a station. And they so that's what I heard, that they didn't want to, that's the reason that they didn't want to make any statement on Julian Assange.
Well, I think the real reason is that they think Julian Assange and WikiLeaks cost Hillary Clinton the election.
Right, exactly. That's I think the reason. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, KPFA has become a very, very Democratic Party outlet.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, NPR light. So we have 5 minutes left, actually 4. I want to go across and give a chance to everyone to have a final word. Scott, Vivian, Kathy, and then Nozomi, and then Ann. Scott?
Okay, well, just real quick, I do a show on KPFK in LA on Sunday mornings, and I have no idea about their resolutions or anything, but I had Nozomi on my show just a few weeks ago there. So, I definitely think this is as important to cover. I'm only on once a week on KPFK, but I think this is as important to cover as the genocide in Yemen or any other thing, because this is the very existence of the First Amendment at stake here. If they successfully prosecute this guy, it'll be the end of national security beat reporting as we have known it, which has already been terrible, but it'll get that much worse. It'll be a whole new era of oppression with the precedent set if they're successful in persecuting and prosecuting this guy. So anyone who cares about the future of journalism, who cares about the First Amendment, has to rally around Julian Assange and justice in this case right now.
I hate to ask Gareth Porter, who just joined us, to give his final word, because it would be his first. It would be his opening and final word. So we could go to Kathy, and we'll come to Gareth at the very end.
I'll just be very brief. So as well as the monkey see, monkey do effect of seeing the first 100 or 1,000 on the street, I think that's very important to keep that side up. But what is really, really important at the moment, and I think we've understood that this has got to be a political decision. It's got to be played out at a political level. So I believe that letters to UK parliamentarians, Ray talked earlier about all of us have some kind of connection to the UK. I'm actually a British citizen originally, even though it's Northern Ireland. But we can actually get in touch with UK parliamentarians. We need to get more people on side. And then we have to figure out how we can resolve certain kinds of contradictions. One is that we would love to get Julian away from the guardianship of Ecuador, but yet we really want him to stay there because that's his safest spot at the moment. The other contradiction, I think, is that a lot of people are saying that Trump owes Julian one for helping him win the election, while at the same time we know that it is primarily the Trump administration and even Trump in 2010 called for Julian's execution. So they are the ones going after him. I think that is something we can make clear, immediately to try and get that out in the media. What is the real case? Work on the supporters online, work on the blogs, and point out that Julian is in great danger from the Trump administration.
We got to get him away from the guardianship and from the Guardian.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I think we've got a few shame journalists there at the moment. I watched Cadwallader's reaction to being I'm involved with Integrity Initiative, and I think no, I don't want to put anything more in the swear box, but I think she was kind of shocked. Well, she pretended to be anyway, but she's got to get her priorities right, and she's won an award, so she might clean up her act. I would hope so. Please, there is an excellent Australian petition, which has got over 25,000 signatures. It's been started by a guy called Philip Adams. we're all passing it around. You can sign it too, and that's we are working on the Australian political side.
Very good. Thank you, Kathy.
Right.
Nozomi.
I think to answer Vivian, to your question about who is responsible, I think the answer is we are responsible.
I agree.
It's 23 hours. I think we given up our own power, given away our own power to all representatives. And then I remember, when Edward Snowden released the material, and he was saying that he actually waited, sitting on the material in some ways, and he was hoping that Obama would do something, because he thought that we now have, and after Obama got elected, he thought we now have progressive president, and unlike Bush, maybe he would actually change, bring hope and change. And in fact, that wasn't the case. And Snowden realized that his president or politicians are not going to do anything. So then he actually decided to do something about it. So, I think when you look at WikiLeaks, one of the significance of this organization is that it really empowered the people. We public have been treated as ignorant, have been so disrespected. We have been treated as if we don't matter. We become irrelevant in this democracy. And WikiLeaks were, giving us primary source material and empowered us. Julian believed in us that we have power, to inform ourselves and actively engage in democracy. So, we have to recognize the source of this organization is really the courage of whistleblowers. And in the same way that Chelsea Manning took risk, and Edward Snowden took risk, and Julian certainly took tremendous risk. We have to take risk, and we have to count ourselves in. So I think the answer really is we are the one really, to really step up to free Julian Assange.
Yes, and actually, if there's time, Joe, and let's
yes, Vivian, please.
Okay, is that I think we should take a leaf out of the book of Hollywood and also politicians, is public relations. And obviously they've got the head start having the mainstream news media to just plant all their rubbish. But the more that we educate people, and actually I'm thinking maybe it's already happening. I haven't looked recently on the, I've forgotten the name of that thing. What's the thing that everyone puts all their work on? What's it called? The software?
Facebook?
No. The thing that you guys set up. What's it called?
Unity for
Discord. Thank you, Susie. I think that public relations, I know there's one thing that makes politicians and Hollywood crap themselves, and that's bad publicity. And I think, no, seriously, they absolutely fall over themselves to, and I know because I having been in the film industry, I also know that when you've got bad publicity, they have a whole machinery that swings into action to counteract that. So I think that ultimately, you're right, Naomi, it's up to us. And I think the more that we educate people in the sense of public relations, not used like Hollywood and politicians use it, which is to sort of, smear over and delude, the public into believing some nonsense. But instead, like WikiLeaks, in fact, very much, if you think about it, that is what WikiLeaks is. It's a huge truth public relations machine, and it puts out the information necessary to forward a movement. Like when you've got a film, you're trying to promote the movement called make this film a huge box office hit, and really the PR that we have to put out is make sure you support a human being, because if he goes down, we all go down, or maybe not such a gloomy bit of PR, but certainly people need to know the truth about him. They need to understand that politicians are terrified of bad PR, and hello, that's why the powers that be are so desperate to get rid of Julian and WikiLeaks, because in a sense, he is their PR nightmare. So I say, all of you, get the right information about Julian, understand that you're working against a huge public relations movement. And that public relations movement, like when I look at the stuff the royal family is putting out, I don't know whether any of you waste your time doing this, but I watch the documentaries that the royal family put out and the things that they, try to forward. And it seems to me that they are struggling for their survival. I mean, maybe not financially, but certainly in terms of public relations. I mean, Princess Diana blew the royal family out of the water. And, you know, really, they've been devastated ever since that. And I don't think there's a person in the world who doesn't believe that Princess Diana was bumped off. But apart from that, Julian needs us as his PR machine. And like you said, Naomi, the reason why is because our PR makes the politicians behave themselves. I mean, I you know, in the land of gangsterism, you know, you haven't got that many cards to play. And, you know, when I think of Rockefeller, did any of you ever see the old films of Rockefeller handing out pennies to poor people? You know, as a very early public relations effort because everybody hated him. And, you know, sorry, I'm going on because I'm the worst chatterbox. I'm going to shut up, but I think I've made my point. I agree with Naomi. I say public relations is the most powerful thing that we have.
Thank you, Vivian. And I'm going to give the first and last words to Gareth Porter here. We're over time by 5 minutes, but Gareth, if you want to say anything, now's your chance. Except you have to unmute your microphone. Yeah. There you go.
Thank you, Joe. I'm not up to the task, but let me just give you one or two thoughts that have been coming as I've listened to the speakers over the last 10 or 15 minutes. I guess, you know, it seems to me it's very easy to come up with very powerful arguments against the case that has been made by the Trump administration as well as by news media, specifically The Guardian. And you know, some of us have tried to do some of that already, but you know, there's a very powerful case to be made, and it's quite easy to put it together. The challenge is to figure out where are the weak spots, the holes or the gaps in the iron curtain that surrounds the mass media to get the message where it can really be effective. And I don't know if I have any answer to that, but I think that is the challenge that we face every day and every week. We have to think more about it and perhaps also come up with, in the United States, try to come up with the names of some people who can reach into Congress and find some of the new voices that might be open, hopefully, to the message that we have to offer. That's a very sort of pathetic effort to make up for the lack of time that I've had, but those are the thoughts that I had. That was very, very, very good and incisive remarks.
Join earlier next
seconds
time.
That I gave you. So, and
wait, I want to say,
yes,
I want to say,
okay.
I'm a big
Ann gets
fan.
the last word. Go ahead, Ann.
Okay, Gareth Porter, I am a big, big fan of your work, and so I hope you will join us earlier next time.
Thank you, Ann.
I second that. I second that.
I
So
also
wanted to
am a big fan of yours, Gareth.
Okay. Well, now we're
I
going
tried
to
to call you today, man. What happened?
You know what? Maybe we'll have a show midweek on Gareth Porter, and we could all come and talk about him. So I want to thank Ann Garrison.
That's my show. I interview Gareth every week.
Nozomi, Gareth, Scott Horton down in Austin, Texas, and Kathy Vogan. And before that, we were joined by Ray McGovern, and we ran an interview with Francis Boyle. And if those of you on the panel and the audience did not see it, I urge you to go. It's right at the beginning of the program. It's a half-hour interview with Francis Boyle, a professor of international law at the University of Illinois, and he spoke about British extradition treaty because he has a lot of experience with that going back to the 80s and 90s with the IRA in the U.S. and the Brits trying to get these IRA figures extradited to. Sorry, the other way around. The Brits wanted these IRA people going there, and Francis fought in their defense. Anyway, he's got a lot of good information about the extradition treaty between the U.S. and Britain, which, of course, as we all know, is extremely relevant to our discussion. So I want to say goodnight to everyone. We're going to end with a 19-minute video that's being arranged now to be shown, and that's how we're going to end the program. So whenever that's ready, we can roll that tape.
Thanks, guys. Did I see John Kiriakou sneaking around there somewhere?
Comfortably seated. Well, thank you very much for joining us, Julian. The floor is yours.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to pay a kind of tribute, I suppose, to Ron Paul and his institute, and the people that have supported him over the years, and what I know from personal experience is a very courageous position, and principled position in relation to the war racket. I think it's much better to describe it like that rather than saying US foreign policy, because there are some parts of US foreign policy which are good. But the war racket, which dominates, unfortunately, the decisions that are made in US foreign policy, is something that is not good. And I think we can see this basically from first principles, that there are types of human interactions which are not zero-sum, which, as a result of the interaction and work, everyone is left better off. But when you're building bombs and dropping them on people, with some very rare exceptions, everyone is worse off. The resources that have gone into the construction are wasted, and you've destroyed the productive capacities of those who have their systems or industry destroyed. But it does make a profit for some people involved. One of the difficulties I have in speaking to this audience is that I think you all know that in some ways, not a lot has changed from when Smedley Butler described this phenomenon of the war racket in the 1930s. There's, of course, an internal dimension to it and an external dimension, which externally can also be a protection racket. But if you understand that just over $7 trillion has been spent since 2001 on the various wars that the United States has been involved in, pulling in some of its allies, but that expenditure is from the US Treasury, together with the interest that will be paid on the loans that were borrowed to conduct that activity. You can see the extent of the wealth transfer into these destructive war industries. And if you see that the US election, let's look at the last federal election, it costs about $2 billion to run, and you compare that to $7 trillion, even just compared, let's say, to Saudi arms contracts of some $400 billion, that even if you just take 0.5% on the value of the Saudi arms contracts alone, you can fund both sides of US politics in a national election campaign. So that's the size of the industry that people are up against. I have a question that I'd like someone to answer, because the answer is not clear to me, but I think it's very interesting, which is the US defense budget has increased by about $100 billion this year, from $600 to $700 billion. And that's very serious. That's a nearly 20% increase in the military and intelligence budget. Now, Trump, in his election campaign, promised an increase in the budget, and he threw down one of his ambitious opening negotiation positions of an increase of $50 billion. And the Congress, including the House, including two-thirds of Democrats, increased that by another $50 billion. Now, $50 billion is the size of the entire Russian military budget. So Trump not only receives all of his ambit claim of an increase of $50 billion, but the Congress has now increased that by another $50 billion. So an increase of double the entire Russian military budget just this year. And I really am very curious as to where that's coming from. So you can perhaps look at some political dimensions of a fight for loyalties. That the only element really of hard power that Trump has is perhaps the military, and his White House has been infested by generals. So perhaps there's a desire by the Congress also to bid for those loyalties. Or does it reflect a much more concerning trend? And I rather think that it does, which is the contraction in the ability of the US empire to rule itself, or rather rule others, which is of course inevitable as US GDP has declined from some 50% of world GDP to some 20% of world GDP today. Obviously, the United States can't hang on to its 500 to 1,300 military bases, depending on how you count them, across the world, when its proportion of global GDP has diminished so much. So are we seeing what is perhaps the beginnings of the death throes of the war racket in its attempt to hold on to that, which it cannot hold on to? Because there is an equivalent, which was towards the end of the Soviet Union. And as its ability to hold on to its territories and regions of influence diminished, its military budget started to skyrocket as well. And if so, I think that's a very unfortunate trajectory for the United States and its people to have their productive industry diverted into wealth-destroying and dangerous military-industrial complex. And perhaps, I don't know if we have time for a couple of questions. How are we going? Okay, that's good. I will just mention one other thing. I'm sure others will mention it as well, but it's of personal interest and a bit of amusement that the US Senate Intelligence Committee, which has 14 senators, just Friday, the week before last, added an addendum to the proposed yearly intelligence bill, section 623. And section 623 is the WikiLeaks bill, nakedly stated, which tries to define me and my staff as a non-state intelligence agency. And I first saw this, I thought, well, that's kind of cool, having your own Senate bill with your own number on it. There was one dissenter out of the 14, which is Ron Wyden. I want to congratulate him for his principled dissent. He has, over a number of similar issues, dissented in the past. But we'll go to the House and it will go to the Senate. When you track where this comes from, non-state intelligence agency, it's incoherent. What the hell does that mean? Non-state intelligence agency. That's very odd. Well, it comes from Mike Pompeo, the new Trump director of the CIA. I hear he was a pick by Mike Pence. So he's pushed that as some kind of Pompeo doctrine. I do know where it's come from, which I will leave for a different time, where it actually originated within the machine. But yeah, I don't know. What should we say? Have T-shirts with all the way to the top with 623, or there should be some campaign to absolutely mock this absurd construction. When it first came out, I said, look, the CIA, it was actually the maiden speech of Pompeo, is calling us a non-state intelligence agency. This is absurd to be called this phrase by a state non-intelligence agency. But seriously, that I think is a very also interesting question on is there any similarity to what media organizations do and what intelligence agencies do? Well, media organizations develop sources, protect them, take their information, analyze it. And the analytical part of intelligence agencies also develop sources, take their information, and analyze it. But the key difference is what happens at the end, or rather what should happen at the end, which is a media organization publishes, an intelligence organization doesn't publish. And on this spectrum between intelligence organization and pure publisher, WikiLeaks is famously obsessively pure in its publishing. That is what we obtain, provided it fits our editorial criteria of being significant and suppressed, then we publish all of it, sometimes to much criticism. Whereas organizations like the New York Times, these are very much closer to the intelligence agency behavior, because they suppress information prior to the elections. They also publish fake information leading to war. In fact, as someone who's involved in the media business and who's been the subject of a lot of media, I can't tell you the degree of contempt and frankly revulsion I feel for most of the media industry. There are some fine exceptions, but these are exceptional people in part because they are such an exception and have to nonetheless deal in that environment. If you think about the Iraq War, we all know the culpability of the CIA, but and the Bush administration, but what is the culpability of journalists in the Iraq War and in other wars? Well, look at the numbers. If you look at the number of political journalists in the United States, but equally serious problems here in the United Kingdom, actually it's something like 5,000 active political journalists. We're not talking about sport or cooking or something. So the failure of these political journalists, national security journalists, their failure to do what they claim is their job resulted in how many deaths? Easily over 1 million, maybe pushing up to 2 million if you include the knock-on effects in Syria and Libya. So what is the death count per journalist? It is several hundred people killed by your average political journalist as a result of their incompetence and their failure to do the job that they promised to do, which is to hold power to account, to not censor information and withhold it from the public if they know about it, and to be ever questioning, and I would say also to fight for the rights to continue that activity. In the United States, that's the First Amendment. Internationally, Article 19. So, are we going? Okay. So just one more thought. It's I think, dangerous in this business to run into the trap of securitizing what we perceive to be a dangerous phenomenon, because if you look at essentially what the war racket is, yes, it's essentially a way to launder tax dollars using some excuse. But what is the excuse? Well, the excuse is that there's some threat, and so they're always involved in hyping up threats in order to increase their share of the tax take. And internationally, of course, it's more of a protection racket, which is you pay us and we won't bomb you. But I think we should be careful about overstating the competence of these organizations. Once you understand that they're basically just in it for the money, the tremendous incompetence starts to be something that that you would expect to manifest. For example, I'm fond of saying that at one level, the CIA is perhaps the most incompetent organization that has ever existed. Let's look at what it professes its competence to be. It professes its competence as protecting the security interests of the American people and, to a degree, its allies. But this is the organization whose actions gave us a theocracy in Iran, who gave us Pinochet in Chile, who gave us the Iraq War and all the terrorism and squalor and death that emerged from that, who gave us Libya and turbocharged ISIS and jihadist groups across the Middle East. This is an agency that can't even keep its secrets from WikiLeaks, a small executive publisher. I find that absolute madness. Look at our rescue of Edward Snowden from Hong Kong, why I was trapped in this embassy. That's absolutely ridiculous. But I have a cool staff. They're bright people, but we're a small investigative publisher. How can it be that in a well-defined toss-up to get Edward Snowden asylum somewhere or have him be arrested, where it's just us lot and a few friends and lawyers against these titanic organizations, and we're successful? It doesn't make any sense. So the answer is that, I'd like the answer to be that, all me and my staff and our lawyers, we're all geniuses. But I'm afraid the reality, the reality is that these are just totally incompetent organizations with a Stalinist bureaucratic structure who don't really believe in half the work that they do, who are always looking about how to get, to get some money, enter into the contractor sphere, and so on. So I think in some ways we should be quite hopeful about those examples of just how incompetent these organizations are. And while at the kind of physical level, installing mass surveillance and producing bombs and dropping them, they are competent and they have good logistics. At the dynamic political level, they're very incompetent. And I think we have to show people that incompetence so people are not scared to resist their activities, which are very destructive, and to laugh at these naked spy kings, which in Virginia are all around.